Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. We are MythVision. Today we're asking the question, who wrote the Gospels? And it's going to be a debate discussion with Dr. Robin Faith Walsh and my good friend Jonathan Sheffield. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you. And Jonathan, thank you for coming back, man.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Robin Walsh. I will be calling her Robin going forward.
Robin, it's
she demands it. She
I
says
demand it.
yes.
Yeah. And I'm so happy to be having a conversation with you, Jonathan. So
thank you so much.
Awesome. I do want everybody to know up front, let's get our plugs out of the way here. Robin Faith Walsh has written quite a few books. I mean, she's still publishing stuff, and she is a professor. Is it at Miami? How do I pronounce it?
University of Miami.
University of Miami.
Mm-hmm.
And she's written quite a, I'll say, controversial but enlightening book on the origins of early Christian literature. For those of you who are interested in actually getting in depth, I highly recommend checking out this book. It should be down in the description in the Amazon recommended list. I love this book. She's done a presentation on this channel before where we've dove into it. And it goes a lot deeper when you read the actual work that she's published. She has a website, robinfaithwalsh.com. So you can go and check out her background and some of the work that she's done there as well. And Jonathan Sheffield has a YouTube channel. If you notice the intro cartoon on my channels, he created those. All thanks to Jonathan. He also offered something special, and I'll probably repeat this between each of your presentations or whenever we have a break between, just to remind people, newcomers that are coming in. Jonathan offered to create up to 5 30-second cartoon intros for those who are interested in having your own intro made. I know that people who have YouTube channels would be happy to have something like this, but also those who just want a 30-second cartoon made, here's an option. We have 2 more slots in case someone wants to just buy the intro for $250. You can enter the raffle at the end by as little as 5, and then it goes up from there as you see the little banner at the bottom of the screen. At the end of this debate, we're going to have me and my dad. Peek your head if you'd like, Dad. He's going to reach in, and we're going to shake it up, and we're going to have a random pick on who won the free, or not the free really, but the intro. So we're going to have a random pick. This is something different we've never done. So I hope that everybody bears with us here. This should be a fun debate/discussion. So go subscribe to Jonathan. Thank you for everything you do, man. Even though we don't come on the same conclusions, we're like best friends, and people hope people recognize that. I also work my butt off. So if you want to help support what we're doing here at MythVision, you could join MythVision's Patreon to help support us. $3 gets you in as an elitist. You get access to all the videos. I'm not like making it to where you only have to enter certain tiers or anything. Just to get in the door, I'm trying to grow an audience. We want to keep this going. And of course, I shared this information out there. There are hundreds of videos never made public in our Patreon. For those who are new, who've never heard me say this spiel, I say it every time. Come support us. We just launched the Ancient Greek Mystery Cults course. Early bird access right now, and it's limited time. That price is going to go up with Dr. M. David Litwa. So go check out the Ancient Greek Mysteries. We recorded it. We did it, edited it, 4K, high quality. It's a college level course. And last of all, I'm trying to go see Paula Fredrickson. I have a GoFundMe out. Come check us out, support us. Your name will come up at the end in the reel, so you'll be in the credits. And also you can throw questions at me. And if it's something that I think is really good in light of her work, we'll use it and we'll record it. I want to get a bunch of recordings for 2 days with her in Boston. Help make the GoFundMe possible. It is in the description. That being said, I think I am done with the introductions. Did I miss anything on both of you here?
No, I like the little Boston accent coming out from you.
Hey, look here. No, seriously, I hope that everybody checks out the description, and we will try to keep up with super chats so that we can put their names in the little bucket. And at the end, I'm interested to see who wins. It is completely random. There is no political agenda here to try and trick people. You have a chance. Anyone who enters has a chance. So Jonathan's going to go first. and he's going to present a 15-minute opening to kind of give his case on why he thinks the disciples, or at least scribes of the disciples, wrote the Gospels. And then we'll allow Robin, you have up to 15 minutes. You can use whatever amount of time you want. And then it'll just be what we call cross-examination, but less formal, open dialogue back and forth. Get your Q&As in early so we can have these names in the bucket, and we can ready during the Q&A to ask your questions or bring up your comments. And at the end, we draw the raffle. Okay. Jonathan, let me share your screen.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to mute.
All right. And I'm
going to start my timer here in just a second.
Give or take 10 seconds or so.
You would. There we go. Clock.
And just let me know when you're ready, Derek.
Okay, brother. All right. So we are at 15 minutes. I'm ready. Let me know and I'll hit start.
Okay, let's start. To begin my dialogue with Dr. Robin Faith Walsh, it is essential to note that the nature of this question before us is not a novel one. In fact, it was a focal point of examination during Augustine of Hippo's discourse with the Manichaean luminary Faustus at the end of the 4th century. To provide greater context for tonight's discussion, it is vital to understand the procedural precedent established for this discourse. In this discussion, Faustus alleges that the New Testament textual documents Augustine cited against him were not written by an apostle, but by some pretender under his name, and therefore carried no weight. By way of rejoinder, Augustine tests Faustus's allegation by walking through the legal framework used to identify and authenticate documents in the ancient world. Augustine sets up his argument by asking the following questions. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? How is authorship ascertained in each case, except by the author having brought his work into public notice as much as possible in his own lifetime, and by the transmission of the information from one to another in continuous order, the belief becoming more certain as it becomes more general, up to our own day, so that when we are questioned as to the authorship of any book, we have no difficulty in answering. Augustine provides us with 2 key takeaways. Firstly, the same procedural precedent we apply in determining the authorship of other common texts of antiquity is the same standard set for the Gospels. In other words, there is no double standard. Secondly, Augustine qualifies his answer by appealing to an important legal standard that tests the authenticity of records and other types of physical evidence in a court of law. In legal context, Augustine's citation of an unbroken chain of evidence refers to the chronological documentation or paper trail that records a sequence of custody, control, and transfer of physical evidence. The chain of custody proves the integrity of a piece of evidence. Next, Augustine pursues his argumentation with an objective demonstration of the method. He tells us, take the books now before us. Should anyone after some years deny that this book was written by me or that Faustus was written by him, where is evidence for the fact to be found but in the information possessed by some at the present time, and then transmitted to them through successive generations, even to distant times? Additionally, the procedure accounts for would-be agents publishing literature under the guise of prominent authors to give notoriety and credibility to the work. In one such example, Augustine recounts several books that have recently come into circulation under the name of the distinguished physician Hippocrates, which were not received as authoritative by the physicians. The physicians ruled out these works despite similarity in style and content, considering the works were not known in Hippocrates' lifetime. There is no confirmatory statement from the author, his known associates, or relevant witnesses to the publication. There is a succession of independent testimonies to the books from Hippocrates' time to present day, which now makes it unreasonable to doubt the authoritative works of Hippocrates. This is an objective standard. Ultimately, Augustine's synopsis provides testable and measurable criteria by which we can historically conclude an author's identity. If we also apply Augustine's criteria to the classical work titled On the Nature of Things, a didactic poem widely attributed to Lucretius, we will see that the procedure is legally sound and supplies a credible answer. Applying the first element, we ask, is there any empirical documentation from those present or near the time of Lucretius to assert whether he is the true author of On the Nature of Things? The answer is yes. In a letter by Cicero to his brother Quintus in 54 BC, Cicero states the poems of Lucretius are as you write. They exhibit many flashes of genius and show great mastership. In addition, Virgil's year after Lucretius' death refers to Lucretius' work in his second book, the Georgics. Second, was this information transmitted through successive generations and to distant times? Again, the procedure leads to an affirmative answer time and time again. Specifically, several historical figures either quote from Lucretius' poem or express great admiration for his work. This list includes Quintilius, Tacitus, and Marcus Cornelius. Because Lucretius was critical of religion, his poem was disparaged and commented on by most early church fathers, including Lactanicus, Jerome, Isidore of Seville, and Bede. While the sole surviving manuscript of On the Nature of Things was rediscovered in 1417, does a review of the documentary evidence point to any other author than Lucretius? If not, then the only natural conclusion is that Lucretius is the author of this title. Therefore, we should be able to apply the same procedural precedent that led to the identification of Hippocrates and Lucretius as authors of their respective works to trace when and where the four Gospels of the apostolic churches were written and by who. As Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Gaius of Rome were able to name some of the authors and provide details for the formation of the so-called Gnostic text. Ultimately, the exploration and interpretation of facts will provide the threads of evidence pointing us back to the disciples of Jesus and their scribes identified as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors guilty of writing the four Gospels. To that end, let's begin by analyzing the relevant facts that convinced the great intellectuals and legal voices of the ancient world like Augustine, Jerome, Eusebius, Origen, Irenaeus, and Tertullian to accept that conclusion. Firstly, as stipulated in their writings, these learned men were able to conduct an objective empirical observation of the church network and determine unequivocally the four Gospels were uniformly received without objection in almost all the independent Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic apostolic churches, naming Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the definitive authors. From the perspective of Augustine, when there is a writing that is spread far and wide and sanctioned by the concordant testimony of churches scattered all over the world, we should naturally have confidence in that testimony. It should not be a cause for doubt. Testimony that should arouse suspicion is exemplified in our observation of the Gnostic factions, who exhibited divergent religious texts with conflicting authorship accounts. Therefore, the evidentiary value of the observation among the apostolic churches is sufficient to raise a presumption of fact that should be accepted as correct until proven otherwise. Legally, our case meets a prima facie standard of proof at this stage in the investigation. Secondly, Irenaeus and Tertullian provided factual support for their conclusions through a legal test commonly applied to ancient documents. They demonstrated the Gospels were found in a place of natural custody, that is, in a place where the writings of Jesus' disciples would be expected to be discovered, like in care of bishops and elders appointed to oversee the churches of Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Smyrna, jurisdictions governed, organized, and frequented by Peter, Paul, Luke, Mark, Matthew, and John. This action classifies Jesus' disciples as persons of interest in our investigation, since the available documentation places them at the scene of the crime. This legal principle establishes an inherent measure of authenticity in ascertaining authorship, as was evident in the case of identifying the writer of the first folio. Recall, those records were found in the natural custody of Shakespeare's colleagues from the Globe Theatre, Henry Condell and John Hemingway. persons having an interest in such works and could account for it. Courts at the appellate division and above have reaffirmed this legal rule for authenticating documents, which parallels our case for the Gospels. Thirdly, Augustine asks why we would deny the ability of the Church of the Apostles to collect and transmit their writings to posterity, considering that the original seats of the apostles have been occupied by a continuous succession of bishops to the present day. Augustine rightly appeals to the apostolic polity, the form of government upon which the churches were set up and organized that provided a system for the transfer, control, and custody of writings received into its possession. Irenaeus and Tertullian bear witness to this fact, confirming that the apostolic churches can establish a legal chain of custody, proving that the gospel records were always in the custody of a person designated to handle it, for which it was never unaccounted for. A record of the chain of evidence was maintained, whereby the bishops who had charge of the gospels could testify to the receipt of that original transaction. This enabled the churches to make a positive identification from whom the evidence was collected from among its jurisdiction in the first century. Chain of custody is the most critical process of evidence documentation to ensure courts that the evidence is authentic. That is, it is the same evidence seized at the crime scene. When Marcion denied the apocalypse as a product of John, Tertullian redirected his attention to the objective fact that we have the foster churches of St. John in Asia Minor. And the order of the bishops thereof, when traced up to their origin, will rest on John as their author. And the self-same process inherent in the apostolic churches also provides evidence to the identification of the Gospels. Tertullian was clear: the churches hold the sure title deeds from the original owners themselves. The testimony of Irenaeus and Tertullian would hold up in any normal court of law based on two legal principles. First, under Federal Rules of Evidence 702, a key factor is the witness's competency in terms of background and experience. Given their roles within the apostolic churches, they are certainly credible to speak on matters of church governance, administration, and its holdings. Remember, the function of the expert witness is to assist the trier of the fact in understanding the evidence. Secondly, the ancient document roll is one of the methods available to authenticate evidence for trial. The ancient apostolic succession lists Irenaeus and Tertullian cited against the textual claims of the Gnostics are documents courts would traditionally rely on because they antedated the present controversy. And there's little that can be done to suggest that the apostolic churches doctored those apostolic succession lists to prove a point in that controversy to win its lawsuit. The next lead in building our case comes from Papias, the bishops of Hierapolis. He provides a statement of record identifying Matthew and Mark as authors of their respective gospels. He identifies his source as John the Apostle, a figure who Irenaeus corroborates Papias knew. Contemporary evidence is also made available through gospel experts, found in the letters of Bishop Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, and the Apostle Paul. This establishes knowledge, possession, and circulation of the writings from known associates of the apostles and whom the apostles appointed to oversee the churches. This evidence is remarkable and it supports the authors bringing their works into the public eye and now classifies the disciples of Jesus as suspects in their investigation. Evidence further supporting these suspects are corroborated in the Marturian canon, Tertullian's works against Marcion, Irenaeus' writings against the heresies, and Clement of Alexandria. Common history from Asia Minor, Rome, North Africa, and Alexandria that all point back towards Jesus' disciples. To that end, we can establish a succession of independent testimonies to the Gospels from the time of the apostles through the end of the 4th century that also includes Lactanicus, Origen, Jerome, Eusebius, Chrysostom, and Augustine. Throughout the ages, this concrete history remained the same up until the 18th century. Well, I'll assume that Dr. Robin Walsh may dispute some of this evidence. I'd like to emphasize that the statistical probability of the accumulated documentation being incorrect is almost zero. In conclusion, Augustine leaves us with a key point from his dispute with the Manichaeans, in that if we reject the overwhelming evidence in support of these gospel authors, then the absolute abandonment of all literature will follow. He states that there will be an end to all books handed down from the past if what is supported and established by the uniform testimony of so many men and so many times is brought into such suspicion that it is not allowed to have the credit and authority of common history. In fine, what can you quote from any writings of which I may not speak in this way if it is quoted against my opinion and my purpose? The strong testimony borne by Augustine against the perverse subjective criticism of the Manichaeans has an important application to present the issue at hand. With that, I'd like to stop and thank Dr. Robin Walsh for listening to my thesis. And that should be right at 15 minutes.
Yeah, you actually you beat your own time. I was shocked I didn't have to add 10 seconds. You did good there, Jonathan. Thank you for your opening. Dr. Walsh, you are next. Or Robin, sorry, forgive me. You are next, and what I'll do is I'll just make you full screen. That way there's no faces, and just allow you to go. I'll set a timer in case. But
actually, you know what? Do you mind not making me full screen? And the reason is this: that so I realized this. I was never in debate clubs, so I never did this before. Debate, which is totally fine, and I see the utility in it. But I didn't want to end up in visiting again, kind of rehashing things I've already done. And I actually just I have a few things to say about what Jonathan just so kindly presented, but I also just have a lot of questions for Jonathan. So I'd be really interested to just try, if there's anything, rather than make you wait, to jump in an open conversation. Is that okay if I kind of take over the organization?
Jonathan, it's up to you. I mean,
yeah, no.
I'll just rant for 15 minutes. I mean, I'm a professor. You tell me, I'll just keep going.
Oh, yeah, no.
I would be curious maybe to just at least present where you're coming from, sure, and absolutely, then just allow back and forth. You don't have to spend however long.
Yeah, we can do it your way.
Yeah, and just to tell the rest of the audience, I read her book 3 times because I was so impressed. And I'm not giving any secrets away, but read chapter 2. If you're going to read anything, buy the book, read chapter 2, chapter 4 too. Chapter 4 is brilliant too, but please do so to really help, even though I got a lot more to learn from Robin on her argument. Definitely go out and read the material.
It's such kind of you to say that.
It's really a break.
I just want to make sure though, like I want to allow you guys to go back and forth, but I do want our audience to track along with us. So it might be good to at least say where you're coming from and what position you take there, Robin. And then when you say, hey, I relinquish, I'm good, let's go into conversation, then we'll go with it.
All right, let's do it.
Awesome. Okay.
So there are a couple of things that I think are important to understand about my own approach to the Gospels and the Gospel authors in particular. The first is I'll just kind of state for the record that when it comes to the 2nd century and later, I'm not as interested in the testimony of the church fathers as maybe I should be. And the reasons for that are thinking about the historical circumstances of the Gospels and their authorship. I do believe that the Gospels were written in the 1st century. I know that there are scholarly moves towards thinking that there may be 2nd or later. There are good reasons for that, actually. There are some scholars who think perhaps what we consider the canonical Gospels were written in response to Marcion, for example. And that is because we don't actually have quotations from these Gospels, discussion of them, or really evidence of them until the 2nd century or later, some would say at best. And so with that as a piece of evidence to back up the case, I just want to say that I'm not in that school that says, well, the earliest evidence we have for them is this late date, therefore they must be this late date. I do think that they are from the 1st century. I think that they're from shortly after the Jewish War. There are a lot of reasons for this, among them being that you do have a turn from the interests of Paul the Apostle, who was very much seeming to be in a space that he believes the world can end at any minute, and thinking more about Christ, not about what we would call the historical Jesus. There's a shift after, it seems, the fall of the temple, where you have more of an interest, almost like the temple falls, Jesus doesn't come back. and people are thinking to themselves, what did he say again? And so that's how I sort of imagine the conditions of the gospel authorship in terms of motivation. What I see in the gospels are, let's just take Mark, for example. In Mark 13, you have a very clear description of what appears to be the destruction of the temple put into the mouth of Jesus as a prophecy. The detail of which seems so minute that it seems almost like that author has to know something about those historical circumstances. You also have, in my mind, in something like the Gospel of Mark, evidence of the use of Paul's letters, specifically Paul's use of Middle Platonic philosophy, to make the case for why what we call the Spirit is able to act the way that it does through Jesus. And so I think that what you have between the use of literature, if we want to call Paul's letters, for example, literature, the contextual genre classification that we often put the Gospels in, which is a life of Jesus. And so some of the, let's talk about Luke and Matthew there, a cradle to grave account of the life of a notable figure. You have that genre classification, I think, relevant here to the Gospels. Great engagement with philosophy of the period, with other kind of literature of the period, and in fact, other kinds of what we might call mythology or wonder stories of the period. You see all of that in the Gospels, which suggests to me, and also you can tell with the synoptics that they're talking to each other. As for what order, we can debate. But you see with Mark, Matthew, and Luke, some borrowing, the idea that these authors are reading each other in some kind of combination. To me, that means they are literature, first and foremost, that what you have more evidence for internal to the text is the exchange of texts, not the dictation to a scribe of an oral tradition or some kind of oral story or account from an eyewitness. In fact, to me, the eyewitnesses in the text are almost encoded in the way that you would find it in, say, even Virgil or other kinds of Greco-Roman literature of the period, which says these people were impressed and convinced by the wonders that they saw, so you should be too. And in fact, the Gospels often are directed to the reader, not to, say, like Herodotus would be like, well, I went here and I saw it, with my own eyes. You don't have that. So you don't have anybody in the Gospels trading on the authority of being an eyewitness themselves. In fact, you have quite what I would say the opposite. You have authority being expressed through literary achievement or literary accomplishments, or being able to engage in literary tropes, rather than having some kind of claim to eyewitness status. In fact, the gospel authors kind of go out of their way to not let you know who they are in the first place, with maybe the exception of Luke. So that's something I'd like to talk about. When you talked about the double standard, it does seem like the descriptions that you gave are a little bit idealistic to what people wish were, is the case for how we can confirm something is original, authoritative, use whatever word you like. Galen, for example, complains that he's walking through the streets of Rome. He goes by a bookshop and someone's selling a book by him he didn't write, right? So we have lots of examples in antiquity of ancient authors, their names being claimed for other purposes, and then those books get into the bloodstream, right? And then they can't control it. We don't have, I like your argument to go back to legal codes. On the other hand, there was no plagiarism in antiquity. And of course, you're talking to a professor who always will default to plagiarism and copyright, but that didn't exist in antiquity. And people had all kinds of motivations that might be outside of the motivations, again, of a 2nd, 3rd century church for writing something that in the 1st century that maybe had other purposes. As far as canon is concerned, too, we have the problem, 2 problems in my mind, among many. One is, even if we do have kind of a chain of command for these texts, we do know that something like Codex Sinaiticus had Shepherd of Hermas in it that eventually doesn't stay in the canon. So these canons of texts that are supposed to be passed on, they change for a number of centuries, actually, over time, according to our earliest evidence. So it's not like the authoritative account of the community was that cohesive, right? It wasn't that solid, even when we're looking at something like 3rd century, 4th century. Origen's canon, had Shepherd of Hermas. I think it was missing Hebrews, right? So there are, I don't know all of the texts, but just off the top of my head, right? So that's not as stable as maybe we would like. Also, in the chain of command kind of, argument, why didn't they keep the originals? the autograph copies? Why are we dealing with copies that are quite old? When talking about kind of like the extant fragments that we have of these texts. As for the idea of the scribes, perhaps the disciples, dictate to a scribe, and that's where we get some of this eyewitness account from. The problem with that is it's not even that I sometimes hear that as an argument from both ways. It's almost like an argument from all ways, meaning it's almost like people want the disciples as they're described in the Gospels to be historically real, the way that they are, illiterate fishermen, but also able to engage Middle Platonic philosophy in their dictation of an account of what they witnessed with the historical Jesus, right? So the tension I see there is the tension between our idea of eyewitness and our idea of oral tradition coming up in against what we actually have in evidence, which is very much, again, a literary text, a text written by an author who's been fairly well educated in Greek, who knows the Greek canon, knows Greek philosophy, knows other kinds of literature, and is trying to insert themselves into a literary field that's, again, according to genre, in terms of telling a life story or a biography of Jesus. They're trying to insert themselves. They can't write something out of thin air that doesn't already look like what's already in the literary field, and they don't do that. In fact, they write something that either refers to texts that are already well known, so Matthew always going back to Judean scripture, for example, or, I could talk about some of the other kind of literary overlaps that I see between something like Luke or Mark, if we just want to stay with the synoptic tradition. So I think that is problematic, to want the disciples to look like the disciples of the Gospels, but then also want them to be authors of texts. So that's something I'd like us to discuss. So I think with all of that, my questions really kind of boil down to 5 or 6. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? All right. So here are the questions that I'd like us to address if we can. Why would the Gospels be needed before the fall of the temple? Or why are they needed if we're thinking about a context for earliest Christianity, what we call Christianity? That looks like what Paul presents, which is very much an we might say apocalyptic, but end time, any moment kind of movement. And some people would say it's very much a political movement, Judean political movement. So why do you need a life of Jesus? Why doesn't Paul provide it, for example? He doesn't seem interested in it hardly at all. What is the role of Paul in all of this? So I've already mentioned that, I personally see the Gospel of Mark being reliant on Paul to some extent, but Paul also describes the Last Supper, what we call the Last Supper. And it's not coming from Peter and James, it's coming from another source. Why doesn't someone like Luke really hang on to I was Paul's best friend, right? Why don't we see that kind of reliance on another founding figure whose works are being circulated early on with these gospel texts, if it's there? And then similarly, why don't the disciples trade on their access, or their historical access to Jesus and their authority for being eyewitnesses? Why doesn't Mark start off with, I was there? Why does Luke say that he's talked to people who have talked to people who were there, and he's read a lot of stuff, and now he's writing it down, right? So why don't we have a gospel author saying, I saw this, I saw that, I was there, if that's what the text is trying to convey? Why, too, do we see such a high degree of literary engagement in the text if they are just accounts of eyewitness testimony or, eyewitness accounting? Why do we see things like, let's just hang on the philosophy point. Why do we see evidence that these early gospel authors are engaging, say, Stoic texts and Stoic concepts? They're using technical philosophical Greek terminology. Even if their Greek is not at a high literary level, they are still using the concepts and the terminology that you would find elsewhere in Platonic philosophy and Stoic philosophy, just for one example, never mind the literary agreements. With things like the Satyricon, which I've already talked about here, so I'm skipping that for right now. And then like I said before, this idea of a chain of command. Why is our material record so poor? If these were recognized as literary witnesses written by disciples or dictated by disciples, why wasn't there more care given to not only the content, because we know that there's some text problems early on, but also to keeping those literary texts in better care if the church is as established, as cohesive, and as recognizable in the first century as the church that we get developing in the second and more established in the third, and then finally the fourth century.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. Robin. I really appreciate both of you doing your opening. So I figure I would allow, how long do we want to do this back and forth here, Jonathan?
I think we could play it by ear. I wanted this more as a conversation to really engage her ideas. And first, Robin, I promise I'm not going to say Dr. Robin Walsh.
You'll try. Don't promise.
I'm going to try, really.
Well, why don't I do 60 minutes just in case? And everybody, just so you know, another reminder, thank you for the super chats that have already been put in. You're entered to raffle at the end. We're going to pull it. My father's going to pull it out of the bag here, or the bucket. And whoever wins, you get a 30-second cartoon, custom made, however you want it. Jonathan's making it. And thank you, Jonathan, for doing that. But thank you for the questions. I will collect them. And then when we're done with this hour conversation, if you want to stop short, we'll go to Q&A. And then after Q&A, once we've caught up on the super chats, we'll go to the raffle.
Okay.
Awesome.
And those are excellent questions. And I think as we discussed, I think one of the first things I want to ask you, because I was just so influenced by chapter 2 of your book, and please everyone go out and get it, because I believe Robin has made a breakthrough in freeing us, or at least the community of scholars or academics I engage with, from moving off the influence of the German Romantics, the German ideology, and taking this approach with her work, which if you're going to read anything, read chapter 2. But if you can kind of talk with us.
I'm going to say what's in chapter 2, and then you ask the question. Would that help?
Yeah, no, that would be great.
So basically what I argue in that chapter is that what we tend to see, even when we start to claim that the Gospels are written by, say, the disciples of Jesus, is that it seems to be understood there that there's a community of people for whom this is being written for it to represent. And that's why we end up actually calling it the Gospel of Mark, or the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, say. Let's just stick to the synoptics to make it simple. What you end up hearing are people talking about the Markan church, the Matthean church, the Lucan church, as if, that testimony from that, even if you think it's an eyewitness, even if you don't think it's an eyewitness and you think it's an oral tradition passed on over the years, say, to the traditional dates that scholars cite, or let's just, if you agree, can I say Mark is first, just for the truth?
Yeah, sure. I wasn't there, so I'm not 100% sure on it either.
But traditionally, scholars say that Mark is first, written in 70, sometime around the fall of the temple, on the basis or the bases of a couple of things. One is that Mark 13 describes the destruction of that temple so concretely. Also, that it seems as though Mark has kind of this short, truncated version of the story of Jesus. He doesn't even start with the baby Jesus. Only Matthew and Luke have a baby Jesus. So Mark is kind of like, if you want like a full cradle to grave story of Jesus, you don't get it with Mark. So it almost, scholars tend to speculate, well, that must have been the earliest version, because it then looks like Matthew and Luke use that as a basis for a both corrected and expanded, more detailed version of their gospel. So usually Matthew's considered number 2, around 80 to 90, and Luke is somewhere like after that. We could talk about those dates if you want. I don't love them either. But the general idea is that you can tell these guys are reading each other, but scholars tend to say there's a community, that whether it's oral tradition or, an eyewitness, these texts are eventually either written down by a spokesperson, by a scribe, by someone representing the oral tradition being passed on by a Christian community or church. And what I argue in that chapter is that you can trace that approach to the Gospels pretty concretely back to the German Romantic tradition. The example I give in the book that just to make it easy to explain without getting into too much like German stuff is the Brothers Grimm, right? So the Brothers Grimm, around the same time as the emergence of the field of the critical study of the New Testament, goes around claiming that they're getting the oral stories of the German people and writing them down to what we consider, the Grimm fairy tales. And they claim that these are the oral stories of the German people going back, hundreds of years, and they represent what they call the folk, the people, the German people. And that methodology ends up being pretty much the same methodology. The gospel scholars are like, hey, like the German gospel scholars are like, so you mean we can get back to the folk, the early Christians, by just saying that this is the oral tradition of their community? There goes a guy. Yeah, no. But that this is the oral tradition of a community. Now all of a sudden we can reconstruct the Markan communities, the Matthean community. They've left the synagogue, and now that's why Matthew writes this thing down, because the people are angry and they want Jesus to have had a teaching that reflects the struggle that they're having historically in their situation, right? So what I argue is that the tradition of the academy, you have the same methodologies being applied to Homer as you do to the Gospels, as you do to the Brothers Grimm. And all of it is a bit of a romantic fantasy that we can get back to these people, that we can get back to a community, that a community was there, that it was cohesive enough to pass these stories on, and that oral traditions are reliable. And so through a variety of different theses, I'm able, I think, to demonstrate that that really is aspirational more so than historical. So that's what the chapter is about.
Well, thank you for sharing it. That was probably my favorite chapter of your book. Chapter 4 was really great too. So let's get into some of the questions. And I guess it goes first to need. What is the either political agenda of these works? And I think if we start with sort of, sorry about that.
Just unexpected.
We have almost 5 kids running around this house, and my dad. So
I see a Red Sox hat behind you, by the way.
Yes, he's a Boston Red Sox. He's from Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh,
so
all right.
Huge.
Hey, if the conversation starts going bad, just talk about re-signing Xander.
Yeah, so we were real happy for him in '94 and everything, especially.
Yeah,
even though I grew up in New York, it was the Mets, not the Yankees.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
So he was mad in '86. So he
Buckner. Yeah.
So let's talk about the Gospels, the need. So let's start off with Mark per se. And I think what we see with Mark is there was a need in Rome. And I think some of the information that we can gather from Justin Martyr, from Hippolytus, there is an account of Simon Magnus coming into the sort of network of these believers and starting to challenge their theological perspective or create his own narrative. This brought about Peter to come into the area. There was a need to sort of hold the narrative per se. And I think this need, obviously, of the people, you have other groups that are coming in to try to maintain the narrative. Those reaching out to Mark to go ahead and compose what, Peter, and hopefully we're on the same page that we can place Peter in Rome. Maybe not for 25 consecutive years, like the Roman Catholics say, but we do have documentation that does place Peter in Rome at some particular time or throughout his tenure. He did have some sort of oversight of that jurisdiction. And the fact that the Christians did have other groups coming in to try to gain the foothold on the narrative. This publication that Eusebius says was authorized by Peter to go out to the churches did help solidify that narrative. And I do think, given that the whether it's myth or propaganda, even in the area of Judea where we believe that this all began, I hate using the word Big Bang. I know probably not the biggest fan of it, but we do have this explosion that does begin in Judea. I think, even from the writings of Tacitus, he does trace what he felt was a crazy superstition coming out of Judea, working its way to Rome. And I think with the publication of Matthew's out to the congregations or the believers in that area, I mean, you have Jerusalem, you have Galilee, right around the corner is Antioch. So in terms of need, we needed something to reach it, to hold the narrative, to build on, even if we hold that it was a myth. There was a propaganda campaign, and what we would say that these figures that I would at least classify as middle class or business people, were successful, possibly businessmen, and they knew how to organize and structure the church. But I think same thing with Paul. I think we saw a need for the Gentile communities, that Mark was addressing something a little different. It's a Roman audience. That's why I believe it's a little shorter, as opposed to the Greek stories that they like to tell all this stuff. We see a little more comprehensive in Luke. But when we look at the documentation, whether it's Jerome or Eusebius, it was to fill a particular need for the believers of the area, whether it's Simon Magnus in Rome that brought Peter out to kind of hold the narrative and then produce propaganda material to propagate that. I think the writing served a specific purpose in building the churches, holding the narrative, and promoting this sort of school of thought or ideology against other groups that were creeping in, that I would say is the apostolic churches had to fend with probably the next 200-300 years until it got state power.
So a couple of things, just that, like my things I take for granted, and my understanding of these things historically. So one is that by the time you get to Papias or Irenaeus, they have, and speaking of political motivation, they have a very strong motivation for creating as convincing and impressive a backstory for what we're going to call Christianity as possible, right? So they have some very poor material to work with, right? Like I know there are church traditions about what happens to Paul, to Peter, to James, but we don't actually know what happened. Like, we don't even know what happens to Paul. Like, he writes a letter to the Romans, like, please fund me to come to Rome, and then I think I'm going to go to Spain, and then like he stubbed a toe and died for all we know. I mean, like there's a church history that, he goes to Rome, he's executed. I think he's supposed to be beheaded in Rome, right? But we don't actually know this, right? In a concrete way that isn't kind of a retrospective that also happens to serve the purpose of creating this august history for Christianity. And also, Paul never said he was a Christian. He remained a Pharisee his entire life. It was a Jewish movement. And my reading of Paul is not only that Paul, while he didn't think the law pertained to Gentiles, it makes sense. They had a different covenant that was being established with the God of Israel through the death of Jesus. And Jesus becoming Christ, but he still saw the law as operational as a covenant between the Jewish people and their God, and one that he still, when suitable for him, always defaults to I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, like I know, I know the text, right? And so his whole thing is that he's interpreting the Jewish scriptures for these Gentiles. And so the thing is, I'm not sure that Peter ever saw the need, even if, say, he did go to Rome, to have to, this is why I said, both where do we see Paul in all this, and what happened to the apocalyptic part? When the Big Bang that you were referring to is something that I argue in my book, which is, we seem to think that Jesus came, he's like, here we go, and everyone went pop, and then it's just like Christianity. We all know what this is. We're all just going to convert to this already established thing that already has a hierarchy and it has churches, and we have to hold on to this thing, and we've got to like send out the message, and we're super organized and we know exactly who has authority and who doesn't. Paul and Peter can't even agree on who has authority when Paul's alive, right? Like my read of this is that Peter and James were like, who do you think you are? To Paul, like, you weren't there. Like you weren't a part, like you didn't know the dude, like you weren't a part of this thing at all. And so you go play with the Gentiles, we'll stay here in Jerusalem and like do our thing. So that's my fear, is that when we lean on the 2nd century and later, or when we lean on the testimony of men like these church fathers who are trying to obtain their own authority as leaders of a developing church, I don't deny that the church is there and beginning to organize by the 2nd century, certainly, right? By then we have Pliny and Trajan talking about like, what do we do with these Christians, right? So we know it's there, right? I don't debate that. But they have their own reasons for saying, my account is correct. I know the real story. I know the foundation. This is the authoritative account. And I know it's authoritative for these reasons. You see the strategy, I think, in these later church authors, and even a greater motivation among these, not church authors, church fathers. You see even a greater motivation to establish a textual tradition and a history that can go toe to toe with any other ancient Mediterranean religion at the time. What I don't see in something like the Gospels, and it's like no fault of the God, like it's fine as far as I'm concerned, but the Gospel authors, whoever they were, seem to just kind of be fighting with each other. Like, Matthew reads Mark, or like hears whatever, like however you want to imagine publication or transmission. He's like, where's the Judean scriptures? Where's the Hebrew Bible? Like what? This is all confused. That's not what happened to John the Baptist. You know what I mean? Like you have all these like changes, corrections, modifications, and Luke's like, where's the drama? Where's the shipwreck? Like, I'm not quite in line with the like, well, the Greeks like like wonders tales more. We do hear authors say, I think Gellius says this, like Greeks can't help themselves but listen to a wonder tale, but that's like kind of racist. Like it's like kind of ancient, like, oh, the Greeks, so we want to be careful about like that kind of testimony, to be like, all people are like this. I don't know if like the Latin speakers would have wanted anything shorter or longer than what we find in something like Mark, but I can tell you that in Mark, what about the Messianic secret. So the Messianic secret is a theory that scholars have had for years, that goes back to a scholar named William Wordy. I think that's how you pronounce his name, where, Jesus, he keeps telling people, don't tell anybody about the miracles I'm performing. He performs a miracle and he's like, shh, don't say anything. Or like one of the disciples will be like, I think you might be like Elijah. Maybe you're John the Baptist, like reincarnated, or like, resurrect. And he's like, shut up. He tells people to be quiet all the time. And so some people have interpreted that as a theological message that, not about the historical Jesus per se, but, like he knew that he was going to be the Messiah and he had to wait to the right time to fulfill that destiny. And so people couldn't figure out who he was in advance, right? He had to, the structure of the story is that the reason Jesus keeps this secret throughout Mark is that he's waiting for the correct time to be revealed as the Messiah to usher in the next stage, which is his eventual death and crucifixion and death and resurrection. The thing is, every single time, people are struck with wonder and they're dumbfounded and amazed and like, who is this guy? And I can't figure it out. That's all over ancient literature. Whenever you have something amazing happen, the eyewitnesses don't understand who the person is. They don't know what's going on. They look at each other completely dumbfounded and amazed, and they wonder who the person is. Like, this is just like paradoxography, Virgil, like it's all over the place, right? So that's where I start to get a little bit like, this just looks like the kind of literature stories people like to tell. So why do we have to imagine a disciple, a scribe, a church? Maybe these, let's call them Christians, are just writing their version of the story about their miraculous figure, about their, son of God. So, okay, I've been talking for a long time.
Yeah, no.
Sorry.
No, it's really good. Let's talk about Paul a little bit, and I'll give you sort of my take. Obviously, when we look at the traditional figures of the gospel narrative, Peter and John. Now, Paul is the sort of expert. Now, and I think what we see going on with that, because if we look at his sort of ministry journey from 51 to maybe 57, going around the sort of ancient world, Paul kind of served for what we see in Jewish tradition, the responsa literature. So for me, Paul is writing to, I would say, established churches. He's writing to Rome. He's writing to Ephesus. He's writing to the churches that were set up. And, and you made an excellent point. There's all these theological disputes. Christianity has never been unified. I mean, we see even between Asia Minor and Rome on the date of when we observed Easter. Irenaeus tells us about it. Polycarp, it's like, can't even get your days right. And we're disagreeing. But I kind of look at, we have the structure of the church as far as this growing movement. It begins in Judea. It moves over into Rome. It starts spreading. And Paul is having to deal with all the laying down evangelical precepts and these letters that Paul, I believe, is writing to these established churches. They're dealing with now the issues of the Gentiles. And what we see is sort of the Jewish responsa literature. I know people you can call them like fatwas or these legal opinions from, the Jews, that he's trying to lay these evangelical precepts and give responsa literature to address these problems that they're having. Whether it's still to control the narrative, he's dealing with real issues in these communities between the Jewish converts and these Gentile Christians. And by way of responsa literature, and that's why we see something a little different with Paul's letters, is he's really addressing the evangelical, or the laying out evangelical laws, and he's dealing with all these problems that are happening in these different communities. Corinth.
I mean, the problems in Corinth, they were.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that from the responsa literature side?
Yeah.
Of what he's doing there?
So I think Paul is, I don't think that those groups are cohesive. I don't think that the churches are in really great shape. I would say probably Galatians and Philippians, like they're okay. He still tells them he hopes they castrate themselves.
Yeah.
So he's not, like, but what seems to be going on is Paul goes to these places. There's an interest in Judean scripture. There's clearly more than just Paul walking around saying that Jesus of Nazareth even is the Messiah. But there's dispute about whether or not these Gentiles have to convert. We might say convert, but to turn to Judaism first. So that seems to me in Paul the crux of almost every dispute that he has in any of these so-called groups he writes to. So let's just take Galatians. Some people think he writes it from, I think, Ephesus, but it's pretty clear he was there. Everything was like copacetic. They're with him. Okay, we have a covenant as Gentiles with the Jewish God through Jesus's death and resurrection. He's defeated the first great evil. That's how we know he's the Messiah. We are sharing in the Spirit with him, the same Spirit that Jesus received from God as the Father. We're co-heirs with Christ is the language you see all the time. Like, we get it. We just have to baptize and participate in Eucharist. That means we're participating in Christ. That means we're co-heirs with him. And then when he comes back, we're going to all be like, we are now part of the in-group, right? And then the second Paul leaves and goes to Ephesus, he gets word back that someone came in after him and said, no. The covenant between the Jews and their God is still valid for you, Gentile. It's not just enough to Eucharist and baptize. You have to circumcise. That becomes, in many of the letters, a big problem because it becomes clear that people are coming in and saying, no, you have to follow Jewish law. So I can't quite see I can't quite say that those churches, like while Paul is trying to create law for the Gentiles as quote unquote converts to this movement, it's not exactly working. And then in Corinth, I mean, the problem in Corinth, as I see it, is that they have taken the idea that they are already living in the end time and running with it. That's why they're going to the brothel. And that's why, Paul has a big problem with that, because they're going to accidentally share the spirit with a prostitute, right? Mm-hmm. So if you read those texts, it's just chaos. So the idea, and the problem that he repeatedly goes back to, I don't see as much evidence for Jewish converts in those letters. I see Paul trying to make the case for a new covenant between the Gentiles and the Jewish God, because as an interpreter of Judean scripture, Paul thinks a certain number of Gentiles need to come back into the fold. But he's not asking them to follow the law. He's saying that the death of Christ is the precondition for them to establish a new covenant. He sees himself like Jonah, like I was chosen before my birth to be the one who comes to you and tells you as a prophet, you Gentiles, that you have to come back into the fold. So I see him with a very kind of, I don't see him going out to establish churches for now and forever. I see him going in and trying to get a certain number of Gentiles to understand the cosmic situation with the idea that Christ is going to come back as that predicted Jewish Messiah, not that we better pick our bishops now. Because like we're going to have to, what year is it? We're going to have like 2022 years of, like having to organize this thing. I just don't see it.
Okay. No, that, I guess from the standpoint, I mean, I believe that, so if we have churches there and they're spreading, I mean, I think by the time of Pliny, they're all over Asia Minor. He believes it's this vast disease or COVID 120, whatever is happening over there. It's spreading into his area. It's getting all over the place. And, even from Tacitus, we see, what was happening in Rome, which...
Is that the Christus passage?
Huh?
Is that the passage about followers of Christus?
Yes. So
that's the problem. Christus was just a name. It might not have been Christ,
Correct. Yeah. But the one thing I take away from his passage on there is that there was this evil superstition. It had spread from Judea into Rome. It's abominable. This group, I mean,
who also got kicked out of Rome, which as a humanities person, I really appreciate the mathematicians.
Yes.
So like it wasn't just like the followers of Christus, whoever they are, but Judeans, Jewish people were often kicked out of Rome for interpreting dreams. Mm-hmm. Mathematicians were kicked out. People who were calculating like birth dates and death dates, with which kind of creeped the Romans out. Sometimes, like, depends on their mood. Sometimes it creeped them out, sometimes it didn't. Like anything that they decided they didn't like, they would just call a superstition, and they would like just kick these people out apparently, and like pass some legal code. But it was almost like a little bit like fitful, it seems. Here and there. So I don't know how much weight to give that as like historical evidence of Christians threatening with their superstition. You know what I mean? And even Pliny and Trajan, which I feel is like secure evidence for sure, they have no idea what the hell is going on. They're like, there are these people, they won't bow to the statue. Like they don't seem threatened. They just seem annoyed that these people are obstinate. It doesn't seem like it's a threatening superstition. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. The only thought process I have in this, for Christianity is, or at least I believe, prior to the Edict of Milan, they didn't have any state recognition to function as a religion in society, which made things a little more underground for Christianity. So sometimes we can't see a full perspective of who they are, but what we see which goes back to Irenaeus. So if you think about it, Christianity is operating underground. Pliny talks about that. That's why he had to put out the pamphlets. Hey, no more of meeting secretly in your homes.
No more morning yoga.
Yeah, no more yoga. Obviously, you're not state sponsored, so you guys don't have any temples or anything else. Yeah. So we see this big movement, and then all of a sudden, what's happening? And I understand from the Roman perspective or the Roman Empire perspective, but then you have all these other groups coming in claiming, hey, we're the true group. So you have this big movement amongst Marcion, the Valentians. You have all these groups. And so when I look at Irenaeus and Tertullian, obviously, we're in areas controlled by Rome. Now they have to come out and speak and bring a little more light on how the churches function. How can we substantiate our claim? And so they're coming out of hiding, and what they do, because there's a whole lot that we can't see in the first century that we could see in the second, but I think it's really predicated on the attacks from the Gnostic communities. And so we see Tertullian, we see Irenaeus, but they give us an inner understanding of the working of the church government. And for me, this is where, and maybe I'm 100% wrong. I could be, but this is where I have a hard time coming over, because when they explain that system or the polity, here's how the churches were set up, here's how we were organized. We see this mass movement, at least by 180, 190, it's in Carthage, it's all over the place. And then even though we have all these different theological differences, I mean, Tertullian became a monetist, we see differences in Irenaeus theologically, but we see the same writings, and they use this big government sort of organization, how they were set up, which explains what we see empirically for Christianity. And I mean, they all do come up with these 4 gospels.
Yeah, but they have to, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, to my mind, like, I'm almost a little bit agnostic. Like, yeah, sure, maybe, like maybe one of these guys talked to an eyewitness for all I know. I don't really care. The reason I don't really care is because it still doesn't, it's almost like I think we could find common ground insofar as it doesn't change the fact that the Gospels are engaged with the literature of the age, right? And that's the thing that I'm trying to push back against, like the idea that what we have is this completely idiosyncratic, never seen before, not based on anything but the oral tradition of a church that goes back to like the foot of the cross. We just don't have the evidence of that, or you would have just had one authoritative account maybe, or you would have not have seen the same literary borrowing. I mean, what you have with the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are 3 guys writing 3 different versions of a story, but with different points of emphasis and different texts that they're engaging with. And so it's that literary level that I just don't think we can divorce in terms of like, who were these authors, divorce them from any association with the literary world that they're in, because they are writing literature. So however that's then treated in the 2nd century, that's why I started off my, like rebuttal 15 minutes by saying like, I kind of don't care about the 2nd century and later, because, whatever the motivations of those guys were, as you said, there's kind of these church fathers are taking a stand, and they're trying to come up with an identity, and they're trying to come up with a history and a foundation for this thing that they are trying to lead. And so they have, in my mind, even more motivation to say, here are 3 versions. I mean, we know there were many more gospels than the 4 that made it in. And especially in the face of challenges from the people, we tend to call quote unquote Gnostics, just didn't end up being authoritative, right? Or part of what's considered now the orthodoxy.
Yeah, they lost the lawsuit. So
exactly, they lost the lawsuit. And so there's a lot of motivation to create that kind of cohesion, and to imagine an early cohesion that, this is why I think our conversation about Paul was so important. Imagine an early cohesion that maybe wasn't there. That's not to say there weren't people sympathetic to Paul. There weren't people who were baptized and participating in Eucharist and like fully, again, like Galatians, Philippians, like more or less like in with this movement that we now call Christianity. I'm not trying to deny that, but the idea back to the Big Bang that, it was that simple, right? It was that simple. And we're just so lucky that we had Peter dictating to these guys. You know what I mean? Like that, like he just happened to be in Rome. And like even the point about like, let's say Mark is shorter because it was meant to appeal to a Roman audience. That's still a literary intention, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I just start to like agitate against the thesis that like these must be the disciples and it must be, you know, eyewitness, and it must be, it can be both. Mm-hmm. I decide though more on the side of, I think this is after the war, because I see a historical circumstance where, unlike with Paul, you have concern before that war in Paul. And from what we can reconstruct from the people he calls opponents and super apostles and whatever's going on in Jerusalem, what we have more evidence for is an idea of, again, like an apocalyptic, Jesus has defeated death. It's the great evil of the world. We know he defeated it because he's resurrected. That means he's the Jewish Messiah. That means the end time is coming, and where we're going to vanquish all of our earthly enemies, including Rome, especially Rome. And, you know, he's amassing his heavenly army, and he's going to come down, he's going to kick butt, and then we're going to all live, you know, in this, you know, kingdom together, right? That seems to be, that's why he's Christ Jesus. That's why, you know, Paul says like, what, 3 things about the historical Jesus? You know what I mean? Like he doesn't care. I mean, it doesn't behoove him to care anyway, because he didn't know him. But like, it doesn't, like, that's not where his authority comes from. Paul's authority comes from speaking to the risen Jesus, to the resurrected Jesus, not to the earthly dude. Whatever that dude did, the earthly Jesus, whatever he said is secondary to the fact that he's died and resurrected. That seems to be what this earliest church is the most concerned about. So I'm interested in why then the gospels have to appear. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so one of the problems I have crossing over is, let's say they were created for this movement. I mean, Marcion did have a claim, you know.
Yeah.
This was the church response to what I was saying, which is historic. That's the claim that they made. My problem comes to opportunity. You just lost, you know, the 94 Red Sox, or, you know, you just lost your starting lineup. Okay. So you have all these central figures, Peter, Paul, John, Matthew, Mark, Luke. You have your starting lineup.
2022 infield. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll go with the infield.
Okay.
So
I've got
you have your death lineup. You have the
story. I've got Casas. All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
My problem is after 70 AD, you don't have these, presumably you don't have any of these figures anymore, or any of these leaders, those that are performing oversight to lead this particular movement. And, you know, when we look at, you know, like the Islamic text, you know, you have the caliphs. Bukhari was able to go in and send out a text to all these different provinces under their rule. They were able to burn the other stuff. You know, even with Homer, you know, you sort of had your Pisistratus. You know, you had someone to kind of organize the efforts. And so for one of the things for me for cohesion, it's almost like this needed to happen before 70 AD. Leading us back to these figures, whether they're myth or history, or they're just making stuff up to hold the narrative. You don't have anyone until Constantine, or any real figure over the universal church until that time. After 70, you just lost your starting lineup. Who's doing all this stuff? Who's organizing with the other churches? Because we see all these fights.
Well, so I don't want to abuse the Red Sox metaphor too much, but it's helpful. I mean, like as much as I want to see him turn out on his ass, Paul is the Heim Bloom of this organization. And so like he's in part the one who, in terms of text, like just from the perspective of the authoritative nature of text, like it's not the case that we don't have something. We do have Paul. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the thing that I think that brings to the fore, though, that we have to contend with is, again, remember I was saying before, like, it's not just even having it both ways, it's having it always. Like, these guys can't be the illiterate Galilean fishermen and also like, you know, caretake the literary tradition that will become the foundation of the church through the, you know, through the judgment of someone as highly educated as Irenaeus, right? Or Augustine. Oh my God. Like Augustine is like, according to his own testimony, the smartest guy in the world, right? Like he didn't even have to go to school. He was already just like smarter than everybody. But like these guys are like high literary guys, like they're eggheads, you know, these later guys, like these church authors, they're eggheads. And to, you know, when it's such a common thing in antiquity to have a text that you want to give a name to, I mean, we see it in the, you know, in the Hebrew Bible too. Like we have texts that become representative of a story that people want to latch onto as a foundational story for later purposes. And to, I mean, even just as a scribal organization tactic to give them a name, right? So that you start to kind of codify that history. I don't see that as particularly threatening to the message contained therein, particularly if some of the source material is something like Paul, right? Who was there early on. He maybe didn't know historical Jesus, but he was there in the early stages of what we consider church formation. So to me, it's not that bad of a thing if it turns out that it's not such a linear development, right? Or that you have certain texts that by giving them the names of disciples, right? Or associating Mark with Peter. I think Papias does that. I think Papias says, you know, no, Irenaeus says that Luke is a companion of Paul, right? Like, so if I remember this right. So when, you know, these later claims are made, there's a utility to that, I think, for the later church that doesn't, whether or not it's historically true actually kind of becomes beside the point. What I think is important about those texts, though, is that they have enough sophistication and engagement with the discourses of the age that make them both palatable, interesting, and, you know, available to these eggheads who are able to take them and read them in certain ways that are, you know, useful to whatever position they want to take. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, no. One of the things I brought up in my discussion, and from reading your book too, and just from what has come out of the academy, is there a concern with this idea around authorship that let's take the works of Shakespeare, that we may be, you know, we're looking at these works and we're looking for Sir Francis Bacon, but we're missing over true Shakespeare, who was a middle-class guy. And it was like, is there that concern that we may be missing the real Shakespeare, even in this discussion with the Gospels? Because I know Ehrman goes a little more deeper into, well, it just wasn't in their ability to do that. But do we get into this situation where we have a case over challenging Shakespeare because we may have this idea or profile of who should have written that, and our eyes on Sir Francis Bacon, and we're missing true Shakespeare for who he is?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Shakespeare, because when I was doing research for the book and writing the chapter about German Romanticism, the author that the Germans most identify with was Shakespeare. And I thought that was really odd, given the relationship between Germany and England. You know, but that the Germans would latch onto Shakespeare as the author, you know, par excellence, capital A author. And it was because they claimed that he captured the language of the middle class, low-lived Elizabethan. Like he captured the speech of the common folk. And so that's why he's so important now. Like, forget the fact that he's copying every Greek author I've ever known, Marlowe, and you know what I mean? He is the author of it. So to me, like, to go in that direction kind of smacks of that same thing of, like, you know, the genius author who represents all people. I actually think it's much more interesting in terms of a sociological development of early Christianity to think to ourselves, like, what if this wasn't the scribe of, you know, the disciple who wrote this, but a dude after the war who's like middle class. We know that there are no from the work of John Kloppenborg. There are no Romans at the level of senatorial rank supporting any kind of Christ group before, say, the 3rd century, right? So even though this is kind of like occasionally considered a superstition, or there's some concerns about early Christianity and its so-called legality, we still know that obviously the church fathers are functioning, that these discourses are going on, like it still exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally, you know, they need, Paul's asking for it himself, some kind of, you know, sponsorship, some financial sponsorship. We know that kind of thing is going on, but it hasn't reached the upper class, right? Like what we might call the Roman upper class, until the centuries when you start to see it creep into, say, I don't know, the imperial household, right? So it starts to grow, certainly over time, and starts to gain the interest of those who are more elite. If these are sort of, you know, the gospel writers, I think, are educated, they know Greek really well. They're not at the level of, you know, high Greek literature. They're not that bad, and they're not as bad as some of, you know, like the paradoxography stuff. Like some texts are like really unreadable in Greek. These are people who have had enough education that they know Plato. Again, they know the Stoics. They've probably read Homer. They've probably read, you know, they've been taught in school. Like we've all had to read Hemingway. We all had to read Shakespeare. We all had, right? They know the canon well enough to know, like, this is genre structure, this is the terminology to use, this is what I need to engage, particularly to appeal to Gentiles, right, and tell them this story. So I think you see that in the Gospels. If these were more quote unquote middle class authors, that's really interesting, and that's why I don't want to get locked into this is the oral tradition of the disciple, right? Mm-hmm. I want to know, like, I can't tell you for sure, and none of us can, and this is the unfortunate thing, but the thing that gives me a job. None of us can tell for sure, is this the oral tradition? If it is, which part of the oral tradition, which part isn't, which part is, like, you know, like we break these texts down to, like, you know, these layers, which one are the real sayings of Jesus, which ones are the ones of the community. Like, people have spent hundreds of years doing this, trying to break it down, and we're still none the wiser, right, as to who this represents, you know, in terms of the earliest Christians or not, or a Christian community or a Markan community or whatever else. But what I can tell you is, based on this Greek, I can tell you something about that author. I can tell you something about how they went to school. I might be able to even tell you where they're writing from if you look closely enough. So I might be able to tell you Mark is in Rome, right? Without the church fathers. And the church fathers were closer to it, so that they may not have had any personal information, but they might be able to tell from the way it's written, like, well, that's how people wrote texts in Rome. Right? Mm-hmm. But we just don't have enough text surviving, right? So to ask those questions to me are much more interesting, because we're just going to spin our wheels if we keep asking, like, who does this author represent, rather than say, who is this author? And so that's why I want to spend more time trying to say, like, I don't know exactly who's around him, but I can tell you that Matthew's reading Mark, right? That Matthew really likes the Hebrew scriptures. And thinks that they're important, that Matthew's really writing a cradle to grave narrative. And so he's probably read X, Y, and Z. These are the texts he knows, you know, like that's the kind of thing. Or Luke, you know, he's read a Greek novel. I can tell that, right?
Mm-hmm. No.
Yeah.
I know Derek asked you this question from me. I think when you had come on the show previously, about, you know, when we look at the gospel texts, you know, we see written in Koine with smatterings of Aramaic. And, you know, I think of someone maybe a little more cultural elite, or these guilds of these cultural producers, you know, I think of someone writing in the Attic or the Ionic Greek, you know, someone from a good school, you know, obviously, you know, I went through the Brooklyn public education system. You went to Brown. There's going to be a difference in our writing quite a bit. And I'm trying to think, does that point back to tell us more about the author, at least from the linguistic side?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing that, you know, that excites me too as a historian is that, okay, let me give another example from Paul, just
okay,
kind of illustrate it. Paul is only one of the only Middle Platonists left, right? Like this period between like 1st century BCE and I don't know, around, like people change the dates, but like this period when Platonism is still popular, but Stoicism starting to emerge, and the theories of Stoicism that help us understand the physical world kind of merge with like the ethics of Platonism. And you get kind of this mishmash of something we call Middle Platonism that kind of borrows from both traditions, right? Philo is in that tradition, Paul is in that tradition, and there are like 5 other dudes. So there's like a book by John Dillon that's kind of old now that's called The Middle Platonists, and like he should include Paul because it's like 5 dudes. That's all that survives to understand. It's maybe 7, but you get my point. Like there aren't that many texts that survive or authors that survive that represent this philosophical movement. What I wonder, like, I'll just throw, I'm not co-signing this theory, but let me just throw it out. Why are the Gospels anonymous, right? So like assume that these later attribution, what if they're enslaved Judeans after the war, right? So they can't put their name on it. So now all of a sudden in our zeal to, tie these texts back to some kind of authoritative beginning that maybe we don't care as much about as Papias did, we have now erased an entire enslaved population trying to write a text about their experience in Judea, right? Those are the kind of things that I'm interested in trying to reconstruct, because to me, that's a lot more compelling. Again, I'm not saying that I know that for sure, but when we start to think like, why would this be anonymous in its first instance? Rather than have those names attached. Why doesn't Mark start with like, "Hi, I'm Mark"? Why does he start with like, without Luke could have he has a preface. He could have very easily been like, "Yeah, I was Paul's doctor," or like whatever. Like, he could have said it. He didn't do it. It would have been a hell of a lot easier for the church fathers if they had said it. Or they could have just like, I don't know why one of these guys didn't just go like, "Hi, my name is Mark." You know what I mean? And like add it, like just at the beginning of a document.
Yeah, so a couple of things on that. Now, my theory, and take it for a grain of salt, my point is that there were underground movement. Part of discussions I've had before with Dr. Richard Carrier is that there was this, investigation. What we see with high officials of the Roman Empire, meeting with Paul and other figures, is similar to what they were trying to do with the Baculi. They see this underground movement. It may pose a threat to the state. And then you have this sort of big explosion on scene of these groups. Nero, in my mind, it had to be a big enough group for him to kind of blame them for the fires. And they're exploding all over the Roman Empire, and the different administrations are trying to understand, how do we deal with these groups? And, we see kind of Trajan. I don't want to take the same thing that Nero did. Let me just quell them. And I think about, okay, you got this huge movement. I don't want to know who I am because we're publishing this. All the churches are going to know. We're going to give it to them. They'll sort of have that seal, or at least in Luke, I see this Hippocratic style of a physician, at the beginning, maybe, and then in your book, I did like the parallels from the Satyricon. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Satyricon, but yeah, close enough.
Yeah. And, what I see there is, okay, is the story in that work, is that a kind of remembrance, or is it kind of satire attacking the gospel?
Yeah. So what I argue in the Satyricon, I'll just spend a minute on it, is that what you have there is a text that's often associated with the age around Nero, but there are scholars who have pretty convincingly shown that it's probably later, more around the time of Pliny. And what you have there are stories that a lot of them kind of echo things that you find in the Gospels. So the widow of Ephesus is usually the most salacious one, which is there's a Roman soldier guarding 3 crucified men. He hears weeping in a tomb. He goes and he finds a widow who's, prostrate in grief. because her husband has died. And so he basically orders Uber Eats, and he yeah, he brings her food and wine, and he spends 3 days and nights in the tomb with her. And the way the text says it, it's very nice. It says that, and then they're overcome with what tends to happen when you're a little bit drunk and have a full stomach.
Yeah.
So some amorous, interaction happens between the two. Then so basically she has a new boyfriend, like by the time the 3 days and nights are over. So the Roman soldier leaves the tomb and realizes that the body of one of the men on the cross has been taken down by the family. And so the cross is empty. And so rather than, he knows he's going to be put to death by the Romans if they find out he abandoned his post. And so then they come up with the idea, well, just put your dead husband's body on the cross. He's not using it. The text is something like, better to use the body of a dead man than kill a live one, something like that. So they put the husband's body on the cross, they leave the tomb empty, and they, go off to, for their second act that we see off screen. Yeah. And so what I say in The Widow of Ephesus is like, that story is a trope story that goes back, some argue, for hundreds of years, that there's some version of that story that's told for a long time until it's recorded in the Satyricon. But it so mirrors, 3 men on the cross, the empty tomb, the Roman guard. There are so many things that sound like somebody who kind of knows something about Christianity. And then there are other things in the Satyricon that kind of back that up. There's a character named Trimalchio who has a meal the night before he thinks he's going to die. And a cock crows, and he tells his friends, when I die, divide my body and blood. There are so many things in that story that you're just kind of like, and also because if this guy is in the intellectual circle of Pliny, it makes you think like, okay, so these are people who are aware of this thing called Christianity potentially. Mm-hmm. And so what I was looking for in that chapter was, it's not sufficient to be like, this is a completely intra-Christian dialogue. And then only, only Christian texts, only Christian churches, only Christian networks, only Christian fathers, church fathers. If we say that, I think that it puts us at a disservice because then we're only selecting from outside of Christianity when it serves us, right? Like we're only going to talk about Nero when we want to reflect on the possibility of the martyrdom tales, which scholars like Candida Moss have convincingly shown are probably overblown and anachronistic. We're only going to go to Tacitus when we need it. We're only going to go to these other authors when we need it. And it's everyone else reacting to Christianity, but not meaningfully at the level of the texts that we think are being actually published and distributed. We think of them as so insular that they're not actually interacting with the outside world. And so what I wanted to show is like, not only do I think the Romans are aware of early Christianity, as they've shown in other political contexts, but they're probably aware of some of this literature. And in fact, they're making fun of it. Mm-hmm. They're actually like saying, you think what now? But it shows that literary level, right? It shows that literary exchange, that this is not just about churches and oral traditions and witness testimony. It's about texts circulate. They sometimes circulate wildly. And I think that kind of wild circulation or unbridled circulation is why you can have something like the Satyricon. We can start to think about it maybe interacting with some early Christian texts. Or you have the need for church fathers to organize some of these discourses into things we call gospels with specific names and histories, to be able to give them the roots that they need in an otherwise kind of amorphous, developing, and kind of Wild West sort of distribution of text traditions about this figure named Jesus. Because, outside of Paul, what do we have? Really, in terms of our earliest evidence.
Yeah. Would you consider the churches themselves as evidence? Apart from the text, there are people that
how early
Paul is writing to. So
yeah, I just don't think they're that cohesive. He never met the Romans. So what the heck's going on there? He hadn't met them yet. It's not a church he founded.
No, it's, I would say it's Peter.
He was already there. I don't think he'd be that nice. I feel like if he thought Peter was there, he wouldn't be that sweet. Because he certainly is not a, shrinking violet, rhetorically. So I don't know. I'd have to think about that. But like, I just don't see, I mean, there are too many other games in town, and Paul makes that clear. Like, we're still not sure what a super apostle is exactly, except it seems that they're performing some kind of spiritual demonstration that Paul says he can't live up to, you know, or whatever it is. So there are just too many players in that early stage, it seems, with competing interests.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that we can say with any kind of degree of certainty that those are cohesive churches. I think when Paul uses ecclesia, and again, I'm kind of following the work of John Kloppenborg here, I think he means an association. Like, I think he means the kind of association that has, you know, like a dinner club, and you look out for each other, and you donate money, and you share things in common, but you pay your dues, and or you're out, you know. So I think there are terms of membership, and they're developing, but I don't think they're there. Like, I don't think that infrastructure is quite there yet. But I think in each case, you know, you can argue to what degree they are cohesive. But I certainly don't think the Corinthians are very cohesive.
Yeah, no, I don't think Christianity is ever cohesive. I don't think we've ever been.
Yeah, they're still not, right? Yeah,
no.
That's the point.
After all 2,000 years, we still can't get along.
Yeah, so it's hard to just have that kind of simplistic version of history that, like, you know, again, the Big Bang, like Jesus comes, poof, like everybody knew exactly what to do. People are messy.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That's been 60 minutes, and I figured I'd come in here so we could get ready for Q&A, if I may, real quick, just to show everybody. Dad's in here with me. We've got a big trash can with tickets here. So everybody who's super chatted $5, your name went in once, 10 twice, 25 times, and it goes up from there. In the end, when we're done with Q&A here in just a second, we'll be pulling. Dad will shake it up in front of you and randomly pull one of the tickets out. And the winner, please email me, make contact with me so I can get you connected with me and Jonathan, and we will make you a custom 30-second cartoon. All right.
And we did say, you know, even though we'll appreciate any sponsorship from the super PACs, that is not going to buy you any political influence to get a cartoon.
Yeah, and if you're interested in like skipping the whole picking, you know, your name out of the basket here, there are 2 slots available. You could just purchase the cartoon outright for $250, but you can email me if you're interested in doing that after the fact. And I've been enjoying this cordial conversation. I like these better than throwing mud at each other the whole time, trying to like make the other look dumb, and instead have a good conversation. So I hope the audience has been enjoying that as well. Dad, you'll be keeping up with any possible super chats from here on out. And then I'm going to start with Q&As, and we're just going to try and chip through as much as we can and then get caught up. Keep in mind, there's a lot of them, Robin and Jonathan. So we may not want to be too long-winded unless you want to be here all day. Okay. First super chat is Nitgundo. Were the Gospels written of papyrus paper and were read like scrolls? This might be a Robin question, I suspect. I mean, unless both of you want to answer.
Do you want it, or do you want me to do it?
Well, we don't have the original, so we can't actually. We know papyri was in use. You know, I think we have a lot of documentation as early as the 2nd century through the 8th. You know, of the use of this material. So as far as what it was originally published on, you know, some of this material could be expensive, you know, that we've seen in some gospel texts, but we don't have the original, so I'm not sure what was originally delivered. Were they delivered as a book or a collection, or what they wrote on? But I think I'm safe to say that they received physical documentation that they were able to compile into what we know now as the canon.
Yeah, just to back up a little bit on that. So you're right; it was very expensive. Papyrus was expensive to produce, to obtain. The work of Brent Nongbree on this is very, very good for anybody who wants to look up his work. He has a book on Bible manuscripts. We know the earliest full collection of something that looks like what we might call a canon was the Codex Sinaiticus. That's 4th century, and it looks like a book. And there's actually a lot of debate within scholarly circles. Why is it that Christian texts, that's called a codex when it looks like a book, like a traditional book like this? So why is it that Christian texts, and the earliest form we have surviving, tend to look like a book instead of a scroll? And I recommend the work of Candida Moss on this, who's published some articles recently, even on how this intersects with disability. Because it was very heavy and hard and awkward to have to hold these big scrolls and, like maintain, like even, the physical labor of that. So when we talk about things being published and circulating, sometimes I think we speak too easily about, too freely about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because these things were expensive. They were awkward as hell. They were heavy. They were not quick and easy like it is today. And so that's the other reason I tend to think these authors are more elite than we.
Yeah, and I think when we look at either P45 or P46, the oldest collection of Paul's writings, it's like a collection, So yeah, I don't think people are just walking around with these books, but
some of the scraps are like bookmarks that were in, some pieces of Paul that were used as a bookmark, something else.
I think we even have a face mask, Mark. That's just a joke for people who get it.
Yeah, no, but also the idea that these texts circulated always together and from front to back, it's not the case. We have some examples of letters that was just 2 pages of Romans, and that's it. That somebody had.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Scott Duke, thanks for bringing such amazing scholarship to this topic in debate form, Derek. Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate that support. I'm scrolling down. Cheryl, good to see you in the chat. How do you explain Acts 4:13? They were unscheduled or uneducated common men. They were day laborers, fishermen. They spoke in Aramaic, and the Gospels were written in Greek.
Okay, so here's sorry about that.
For you.
Who is that man?
Yeah, sorry, my dad. When he's 80, I think he get him. So here's what this is referring to, or at least my interpretation of it. We're talking about those on the Temple Mount, those are well-educated, those that went to the best schools, which is why I brought up in my thesis about Shakespeare. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He was a middle-class guy just like that. So as far as being uneducated, they weren't from the temple schools or the schools on the Temple Mount. But I think what the Gospels do convey is that there's these middle-class businessmen. They're middle class. We have a publican, doing work for the Roman Empire. So you got to take records. You have fishermen, and we're not just talking about someone going out there on the stream. We're talking probably about a fleet. So you're going to need money for that. You're going to need to deal in contracts. So my understanding of these figures, they're running businesses. Jesus, a carpenter, doing the work in Philippi. So we're talking about people that were part of the economy. So the fact that they didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge doesn't take away their ability that they could have written these works, especially with this Greek. The way we see this now, I do recommend a work, and Robin, you may be familiar with this, but it's actually a really good discussion on it. It's actually Do You Know Greek? It's by J.N. Sevenster.
Your dad just squatted down and said, like,
Dad, no more. I apologize for that, everyone.
This is great. Again, put him on. I got baseball questions.
Oh yeah, no.
I want to allow you to respond too, Robin, to this. You probably have a different conclusion.
They were fishermen. They didn't write it.
Right. I kind of figured. I mean,
yeah, easy, done.
Yeah.
Jonathan,
the recommended work you were going to say?
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. It's actually a really good work. Are you familiar, Robin, with, do you know Greek? How much Greek could the first Jewish Christians have known? By J.N. Sevenster?
No, I don't know that.
It's actually really good. He goes into his arguments that, they could have, and he goes through the sort of archaeology, the written correspondence. He deals more with the what we see in the economy, with the deeds, but he actually goes through his thesis on it. I actually got to work after reading J.T. Robinson, an Anglican who he has a sort of interesting thesis on the Gospels before 70 AD because they don't mention the destruction of the temple. So after reading him, he quotes from it quite a bit on what we see like in the book of James, the Greek of James and such. But
Thank you.
The person that answered, that's a good book to kind of read in what would have been the ability of the disciples in that period to write something like that. So they argue for that thesis.
Okay, we'll keep moving. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners. Irresponsible speculation, but I wonder if the gospel writers were the equivalent of failed Greco-Roman novelists in today's terms. Thoughts?
Love it. I mean, in the sense that like they maybe didn't have the ability to write super high literature is how I interpret that question. Or is there another way that you're reading that?
I imagine that's how I'm reading it.
I think that do you mind if I jump in here?
Yeah, no, please.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I think that Mark doesn't get enough credit. I've said this, I think, before here, which is, all of this kind of mystery that surrounds the gospel and even kind of this short, he loves to say, and immediately, over and over again. I think that's intentional. And, some people talk about the original ending to Mark being shrouded in secrecy too, that the women are afraid and they don't want to tell anybody. Like, I think if we're not trying to say that, Mark is Peter's spokesperson, more or less, like what you have there is really someone attempting kind of like an Agatha Christie, right? Like, trying to attempt something that's a little bit more mysterious. Like this is a mysterious figure and like a completely, wondrous circumstance. So he writes it that way. And I've already mentioned a couple of times that Luke is the Hangover. Luke is it's a buddy film. Guys like going around like shipwrecks and like crazy things happening. Like it's like a little mini Odyssey kind of, you know what I mean? Like he's writing at a time when the Greek novel is really popular, and Acts is the same thing. I mean, like they're angels blasting off handcuffs. I mean, like, why there is not a movie about Paul, I have no idea. Like,
I think there are some movies, but it's
it
not like
out,
Hollywood.
Out on Netflix soon. So.
Yeah, in The Last Temptation of Christ, Scorsese had that like one little like scene, and it's like the most brilliant thing ever. Like that is Paul. Like there are other attempts to like make a Paul movie and it hasn't happened. But if you look at what goes on in Luke Acts, like that is like Greek novel, Right. I think these are just normal authors who are like, here's a really great subject matter, right? And like now they're going to try their hand as literary authors within a genre at that kind of writing.
Continuing. We're good. David Aaron Hill, thank you for that super chat. The apostles' legendary journeys are third hand at best, reports. Mark's account also portrays them in legendary past. Temple anxiety applies 70 to 135. No question, but maybe at best, would you say the apostles' legendary journeys are third hand at best reports? I know you wouldn't disagree. You would disagree with this because you would say that the disciples wrote the.
Yeah, that's why I went.
Yeah, for me, it still comes down to, what documentation I have, the sort of circumstantial evidence, in the sense that if we talk about Mark, we have a church at Rome. When I look at what Justin Martyr is writing at the turn of the first century, and even Hippolytus afterwards, there's this figure that comes into the city. I don't know, he's a superhero, Simon Magnus, but he comes in. The Christians are trying to gain hold of the narrative. It kind of speaks to that situation that Suetonius is talking about, some sort of event that the Jews are getting upset about. So it kind of fits the portrait that we needed somebody in Rome around this period that would fit the facts of the case. So I'm, let's say it's not Mark. It has to be somebody. The Church of Rome does have these books. So how did they get it there? Why did it flourish? Why did they continue to promote it? It's all over these other churches, and Mark apparently goes to Alexandria, and we find the text there too. Does it fit the facts? Maybe not. But who is this third-hand person doing it? And I think it goes back to, I'm sort of looking for my metaphorical Pisistratus after 70 AD, who could have done this. And absent a name, it's hard to say if it was third-hand. It could have been third-hand in 42 AD, It could have been third-hand information. It couldn't have been from Peter, but it could have been a person in that vicinity that had access to churches to distribute those texts.
The only thing can I add to that is, not being able to talk to the person who wrote the question. The reason I think they wrote 70 to 135 is they're talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. Mm-hmm. Something we have not talked about, which is very interesting, and something that I think would be even it's worth its own conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll throw in there, because and we should have talked about it a little bit more, because I know
I feel guilty now once I saw.
And I do think part of it is because when people bring it up to me, this whole idea of they're predicting the destruction of the temple. I believe the Jews knew that their temple was going to be destroyed. I don't think it would have been much of a prediction. I think
Jesus.
Yeah, even if Jesus predicted that, I don't think it's much of a prophecy, because I think the Jews knew one way or another Rome was going to come in and destroy their temple. I think it was inevitable. It was going to happen. They're lucky it didn't happen previous to 70 AD, but I think there's I don't even think that could even be classified as a prophecy, because it was inevitable that situation was going to happen, especially with the changing of the administrations, even from Tiberius to Claudius. There was a different perspective that they had on the Jews, on the way they were dealing with them. So I think it was inevitable. Your thoughts, Robin?
Well, like I say, that's something I could end up ranting about. I know we have to.
And we will. How about we do at some point?
Good talk to have. I'll just say that, there's a lot. For those who don't know, the Bar Kokhba revolt is another revolt I think he dies in 135.
Uh-huh.
So there's
the other Messiah.
Yeah, he claimed he was the Messiah, not as far as controlling Jerusalem and minting coins, until he was finally dealt with by the Romans. But I would just say we should highlight the extent to which the Romans the Flavians specifically, made such a big deal out of the destruction of that temple. Today, what was called the Flavian Amphitheater in antiquity, which we now today call the Colosseum, was built from the spoils of that war, including the triumphal arch next to it, the Arch of Titus, which has the menorah being marched through the streets of Rome as a triumph, and multiple coins minted with the Jews represented as a naked female captive with her hands tied behind her back. They relished the destruction of that temple, the wealth they got out of it, and what it represented symbolically. And it was, I think we actually underestimate how important that was as a rupture event. not only in the first century and in the Roman Empire, but also for this bifurcation between what we call Christianity as a Jewish movement and what then is developed, which is why I emphasize that I think the Gospels are after that war. Because before that, you just have the Jewish movement of Christ Jesus, and nobody renounces their Judaism. Paul doesn't renounce his Judaism. None of these early followers do. They remain Jewish the whole time. It's not like Christianity becomes a religion and they all become Christians, right? They're Jews. And then that war happens. And then Jesus never talks about the temple. The historical Jesus never talks about the temple, except that, 12-year-old baby Jesus is supposed to have gone there, right? But he has a set of teachings and an understanding of Jewish scripture that does not require the temple. So even I agree with you, like prophesying the temple's going to fall is like prophecy 101, right? Like that's definitely prophecy 101. But the fact that the rest of Jesus's teachings don't require the temple, that temple wasn't there anymore when those Gospels were written.
Appreciate that. Paulus Drake says, do either of you have a perspective on the we passages of Luke Acts? Do they add anything to an argument for Lucan authorship of Luke Acts?
Do you know more about this, Jonathan? I've read a couple articles about it, but I don't have a
well, so, from my perspective, and, take it with a grain of salt, it shows
Dad,
that...
Can you hand me the salt? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, hand me the salt. For me, he's a co-companion with Paul during his journey. So from the perspective that, I'm arguing from, that Paul is going out and organizing these churches throughout these Gentile lands. Luke becomes very important because what gospel is he going to these Gentile nations? The need that Jerome and Eusebius talks about, what we see in even the Muratorian fragment. There was a need for this gospel that obviously Matthew and Mark were reaching different audiences that he needed. So, which, when I think of the we passages, this is the gospel that they say that, when Paul talks about my gospel, that, this is what he's referring to Luke. So Luke was that sort of, friend, we, while we're going on these particular journeys. That was the resource he had when he was spreading the gospel. He had Luke's gospel. At the same time, he's obviously taking these notes of their journey to talk about these acts. So the we is a co-companion. We can sort of date where Paul is conducting his ministry between 51 and 57, which gives us an idea about the Gospels themselves, at least in my thesis, that, we can place, Luke, which references other works out there, around the 50 time mark, and then he doesn't say what happens to Paul anymore. Does that place Acts at 62? So
my question, where do we put Acts?
Yeah. And Eusebius goes to that argument as well, and he kind of dates it back to 62 because, well, what happened to the we's there? It's no longer there. So that's how I interpret the we passages. I think it's consistent enough with what I'm trying to argue. But what do we mean when we say we? Is it the royal we, or is it indicative of a person, that's a companion of Paul?
Did you have something you wanted to say on the we passages, Robin? Or?
There are a couple articles. Let me follow up with some bibliography. I feel like Jennifer Isle has talked about this, but I don't want to put words in any scholar's mouth without double checking, but I also don't want to scramble. So, but the message would be that this is a common literary device, so
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't dictate date. It just dictates craft.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger. Thank you, Pat. Numerous textual experts such as Dewey and Schmidt have demonstrated the assembly of Paul's authentic letters from parts. Why not Mark and others?
So, yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, even something like Second Corinthians, some scholars speculate are actually multiple letters to Corinth that didn't all survive, in full part, so that they've been kind of shuffled together into something that seems more cohesive. You certainly have examples in early what survives in terms of early copies of these gospels with certain stories kind of floating around. Isn't the adulterer? I mean, I know that you go with the Byzantine, right? So I'm being careful here. But
it could, and I think we see that with the LE too. Is it a second century, development, or the PA was this kind of this floating tradition that may be representative of some actual event that caught on with the churches and got spliced into the text.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a big deal to do that in antiquity. We have a much more precious idea of how these texts should be preserved. But, if a story's floating around and people like it, it's not that big of a deal to kind of insert it into the tradition. And, what I sometimes tell my students when this, scares them, that's not the original ending of Mark. Someone added, to Mark, someone touched these documents, or they sort of Frankenstein them together. You got to remember, regardless of what you think the inspiration is of these texts, they're coming through human beings, and human beings are and so that's what we end up tracing when we have these historical questions. And so, I think for sure what you have is kind of, some would say, a pastiche. At best, based on various criteria of putting these things together. Again, we don't have autographed copies. We don't actually know what any of these things originally said. We're just doing our best guess for putting them back together again.
Thank you. Humpty Dumpty. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, thank you again. Thoughts on parable? I suspect this one's for you, Dr. Walsh. Thoughts on parable of the gnat and lion between the slaves in, is it Leucippe and Clitophon, BK2? This subversive parable seems close to Jesus and Aesop.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that specific passage. Right off the top of my head, it doesn't ring a bell, but in my book, at least, I suggest that Jesus is in the tradition of Aesop. There's a chapter 5, I actually talk about subversive biography. So the word subversive, I definitely latch onto that Jesus and his teachings and his life story, even the expectation of what's supposed to be your hero being gruesomely crucified. Even from the perspective of the Jewish Messiah, who's supposed to be this warrior figure being gruesomely crucified, it's more in that tradition of the Alexander romance, or something like the life of Aesop. Even Socrates dies, at the end. He's a philosopher who's kind of falsely accused and, of corrupting the youth, and he dies too. So there's a long established literary tradition for these kinds of figures coming to some kind of, who tell parables, who have miracle workings, who come to these, and are philosophers who come to these untimely ends.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for becoming a member of MythVision's YouTube. Really appreciate that. Dylan Roberts, slightly off topic, but why does Paul state in all his letters that they will recognize him by his own handwriting? Then Romans says, is it Tertius? Yeah, Tertius wrote it 1622. Why is it still attributed to Paul?
Well, and I think this, and, they did have scribes, which help you write, edit, assist in the creation of this, but those who are dictating it. I think we see this in the ancient world, and remember, people didn't have glasses back then, in the sense of as you get older, your eyes
can't read.
Yes. And we see that in antiquity, and that's why we see historical figures walking back and forth, and they have their scribes dictating. But, and we see some of this even in Marcion, even in his claims, even though he understands that Luke was a scribe, this was Paul's gospel, and it was identified as his particular work. And, that's why even in the tradition of, Mark being the scribe of Peter, for me, when I look at Revelation and the Gospel of John, I think, wow, in Ephesus, can you imagine the type of scribes and philosophers you had at that Mecca? But on Patmos, what you would have had, I mean, you would have been in the desert. I mean, who would you had there to really write for you? And maybe that's how I explain the differences in literary style, or even between 1 and 2 Peter. I mean, in the Bible throughout, or especially in the Gospels, they talk about all these scribes. Who are they? Well, Paul actually gives one of their names in Romans 16:22 when he says Tertullus wrote it, but obviously it was coming from Paul. Any thoughts on there, Robin?
Yeah, again, I know you had her on recently, but the work of Canada Moss, she's written about this too. Paul says something about how, like, look at me, I write in such big letters. I'm like, look at how crappy my handwriting is. Like he occasionally, I've always I don't know if anybody's written on this. This is just me being me. But I've often wondered, when you have parts of, say, like Galatians, where he starts to talk about Sarah and Hagar or something, sometimes I've thought he could be like, and blah, 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 you write the Sarah and Hagar part, and then da, 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 like it's possible that, I don't, Paul's, being a Pharisee, being a Roman citizen, he's coming from a much higher economic plane than most people in antiquity, given literacy rates. I think he's kind of used to having, some help. I don't think he's used to doing his own work.
Thank you. YouTube Punk, the Church of the Flying Man, and the Pocket Locker 86 community enjoy these scholarly discussions and displays of Bible nerdery. Myron, bless you, Derek. It's an online joke, kind of an online community of the Flying Man, but it's something that people test epistemology with. Thank you, YouTube Punk. I appreciate that. David Aaron Hill. So Mark is the first, besides Q-ish sayings, right? Was he responding to another literary narrative that he was subverting? Yeah, you might as well start, yeah.
Do you want me to even talk about, why don't I leave Q to you, unless you want me to say something? We don't, Mark is actually looking at Q. That's disputed if Q.
Yeah, and this is why I liked our conversation with Dr. Goodacre, because that's a point we agree on. I think it's hard to, I hate to say this in a bad way, but believe in imaginary documents per se. Now, if, were there other writings? And I think in the Gospels themselves, there's these other groups performing things in the name of Jesus. And I think there was other literature out there. I think, even maybe Luke kind of appeals to some secondary literature that was out there. But if we look at all the churches, we don't see any Q document. So I wouldn't debate that there was other literary information that was out there circulating. I think the Gospels make mention of, people performing stuff in Jesus's name, and there's these other writings. But I don't know if he's using Q. I didn't have his notes, but at all. But me personally, I think when you read Mark, even though it's kind of all over the place, and it sounds like someone's putting together some sermons, especially at the end. It's like, oh, I'm losing this audience. Let me end it. But what are your thoughts on?
So I'm about to publish an article, I guess a book chapter about this. But I've already said, I think that you cannot understand what in the world is going on with something like Mark 5 unless you've read Paul. I think the author of Mark is a good Middle Platonist who understands how pneuma works, that, the spirit, how it's functioning. He keeps talking about the pneuma and dunamis, which is the word in Greek for power. He keeps talking about how that's functioning with Jesus being able to perform the wonders that he performs. And then the reactions of the eyewitnesses. I'm about to publish this chapter that I basically insinuate that the gospel author, that Mark knows the work of Virgil, that I see the same thing in the Aeneid. And so I think that it's just an indication, again, of education. And so even if somebody like Mark isn't actually reading Virgil because he doesn't know Latin, he knows the rhetorical techniques. So he's, I think, commenting on the biographical genre. I think he's aware of, again, things like Life of Aesop, say, or other lives of philosophical figures and leaders. I think that he has read the letters of Paul, and is using that as the basis for his account.
Thank you. Hunter Biden's laptops, the Church of the Flying Man, and Pocket Locker 86, entry number 2. Okay, thank you so much for that super chat. Trying to hurry up here. I know, Jonathan, you got to go here soon, so let's try to do as quick as we can here. Grays 174, is there a reason to believe the Gospels are post-70 beyond the prediction of the temple's destruction? That might be good for you, Dr. Bird, because you're the one who would take the after the war position.
You mean me?
I'm sorry. What did I say?
I think you called me Dr.
Our post-70.
I thought I said Dr. Robin. My bad. I might have.
I mean, Robin's a bird, if you said just a bird. So I already kind of said it, which is Jesus doesn't have any teachings that need the temple. So that's interesting.
So instead of the prediction of the temple, what you're saying to Grays here is it's the teachings that don't require a temple at all.
Number one, he predicts it's going to fall. And number two, he doesn't require the temple for even his version of Jewish teachings as a Jewish figure in the Gospels. So I think that's a sign it's not there.
I do believe Marcion makes a good case. I mean, we do have a historical case in the ancient world around 130, 140, that a number of these Gospels, with the exception of Luke, or the form of it that he was aware of, that do post-date it. There was other factions and group that maybe didn't win the lawsuit, or they just didn't have good attorneys, that couldn't make their case. But, I mean, if you look at the Valentians, the Marcionites, they did challenge the textual claims of, whether we say Pauline or Peter's churches, but there are claims out there. So there is evidence that does go the other way. And Robin brings up a point, but there's key historical figures. I mean, even Faustus, I didn't believe it was part of that. So I think there is evidence on the other side as well.
Okay, we'll keep moving. Pat Lowinger, Mark's secrets equals nod to the mystery cults, in his honest opinion. I mean, it could be the case.
That's going to come back because scholarship functions on like a 20 to 50 year cycle, and like we debate an issue and then we settled it, and then like it goes dormant and then it comes back like a super volcano. I think the mystery cult question is going to come back.
I think so too, and we just did a mysteries course, so if anyone wants to hear about the language of mysteries, go sign up. It's in the description. Dylan Roberts, is it plausible that the Apostle John lived as long as they claim and lived through the Jewish war, yet only wrote anything down in his 80s, 90s?
No.
Jonathan would say, yep.
Do you remember Last Temptation of Christ? Wait, so, like, who comes in who's supposed to be Peter? What's that actor's name? You know what I'm talking about?
Mel Gibson.
No, it's not. Harvey Keitel.
Oh, Harvey Keitel.
Keitel comes in with his Brooklyn accent or whatever it is. And that's Hollywood. And he's like bloody knuckles. Like, those dudes went down. Those dudes went down when that war happened. Anyway.
Thank you, Dylan. I appreciate that. Pat Lowinger, again, it's question to assume Gnostics are a later development.
No, I think there was other communities out or other groups. I think Paul references them. John does. So, and
says there's still John the Baptist worshipers wandering.
Yeah, I think even things that we see in Paul, and maybe you picked up on this too, Robin, but, I baptize you in the name of, Jesus, because there's this other view of, people that are performing baptism. So we're defining this as the baptism of Jesus because you had all these other groups. So I think you had all these other groups. I mean, in the Gospels, it does make, even if even if we say the Gospels were 40, well, they even recognize that there was other groups performing stuff in Jesus's name that shows that those groups did exist.
Yeah.
So they did have natural claims that they could make.
Yep. No, I agree.
Awesome. I'm talking crap to Jonathan in the private chat right now. Grays174, what is the thought process behind writing detailed resurrection appearances in Luke, Acts, and John? If the author does not know they happened or any eyewitnesses, is there a name for this phenomenon? So it might be a good question for you, Dr.
Sensationalizing, or
I wanted to say Dr. Robin.
Well, it's like, super important. You gotta give a good account. And yeah, the eyewitnesses, I kind of mentioned it before. There's a tendency when you're making some kind of, what might be otherwise construed as a pretty implausible claim, that you need eyewitnesses encoded in the text to justify it. It's like, because there weren't photographs in the ancient world, and, news traveled really slow, and it was hard to convey to people what things looked like, or, events that happened. There was something called like phrasis. So back, is there a name for this phenomenon? Where sometimes you would have writers go into such detail about like a frieze or a painting, to just like try to convey to a reader, this is what it looked like. And the idea is to try to like put you there and give you that experience. And so what it was like to be there, to witness this thing. And so when we see historians kind of do the same thing in terms of a literary device, they do something, they give such an ekphrasis, such a detail of an event or something that they've seen or want to claim to have seen, that it's supposed to kind of, as a reader, it puts you there too.
Okay, Jonathan, you're going to have to go here soon. So let's try and get a couple more. And then I'll wrap up we're going to do the rest of the super chats with Robin. We'll do the raffle and stuff without you, man. You'll be here in Panuma. How about that? You'll be here in Panuma.
Yeah, I'll be there in Panuma, in spirit. It's obviously it's a National Independence Day for Mexico, San Antonio. There's a big event. We have some stuff scheduled downtown. So I just want to beat traffic and get there right on time.
I'm getting a text from my husband with pictures of my kid in the tub, so I got to go soon too.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got to wrap. Like, that's why I'm trying to do this.
I got to be there first.
I know you have to go, Jonathan. If you want, I'll finish these up with Robin.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me just. Is it more likely that Jesus never existed, or the
Gospels are written by eyewitnesses? I'd like to get Robin's opinion.
Yeah. I'm going to take off.
Okay, brother.
Oh, you're just going to abandon me, I see.
Look, he is in this panic mode. Andy has a scholar from out of town that's actually visiting him.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I think my dad is I'm going to have Derek send you over a Red Sox question, because I know he's dying to ask a question. But
let me finish up with Robin, because she's got to go too, brother. Thank you for participating, man.
Thank you so much, Robin and Derek.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so I'm going to try and make this quick, because I know you have babies at home ready for you to be there with them. And Jonathan's a sweetheart, but he will keep going on. He just private messaged me 10 minutes ago.
And he did, though, unfortunately.
No, it's all good, but he's like, I got to go here soon. And then he talks. And I'm like, Jonathan, come on, man. What is your opinion on this? Which one do you think is more likely, that Jesus didn't exist, or that the Gospels were actually written by eyewitnesses? And this is subjective as hell, by the way.
I don't think it's either. I'm
Right.
one of those scholars that think that Jesus didn't exist. Because it doesn't make sense to me. Like, what are, so I lean on Paul, right? Because at least there's somebody writing something in an early stage. And, so what the heck? He says he talks to Peter and James. It doesn't actually go very well, but he's at least talking to them. So what the heck was that about? What were those guys doing in Jerusalem? It just seems fantastic to me that you'd have to have such a conspiracy theory to think Jesus didn't exist. Now, it's certainly the case we don't have, like, say, Pontius Pilate's execution lists or something like that. We don't have independent attestation outside of Christianity that Jesus was a real person. But I think that, whether we want to say like more likely Occam's razor or whatever, I think it's more likely he was a historical person. Is he the person that Paul portrays him to be as Christ? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. Is he the person that the later church latches onto as a figurehead, what we might call the historical Jesus? I don't think that's accurate either. I think we've lost him. Whoever he was, I think we've lost him to history for the most part. The idea of the Gospels being written by eyewitnesses, this is tricky. I guess if I had to take one side or the other, I would take the eyewitnesses side, only because, not that I think they wrote these Gospels. I don't think they could. I think if we, like I said, I don't even know if they were fishermen, but you can't have it both ways. They can't be fishermen and also writing highly technical philosophical documents about the nature of the Spirit. Okay. Like, they can't be doing both things the way that we're giving them credit for. And so I think that the way oral tradition works, the way that eyewitness testimony works, again, we've lost it. Whatever was true to those eyewitnesses, say Luke is correct, that he read whatever he could read. Some of that stuff clearly doesn't exist anymore. He might mean Mark, he might mean what we call Q. But we don't know what he was reading. He says he's reading something, and he says he speaks to people who either are themselves eyewitnesses or knew some eyewitnesses. Do you know how many lies my father tells me about the Navy? And I love them. I record them.
I should put you on loud. My dad's Green Beret, retired Green Beret. He'd be like, yep. She just said, do you know how many lies my dad's told me about the Navy? Because some eyewitnesses. And I bet you've told us some stories too, It's a soldier thing.
Well, I want to he believes he can back some of them up. He claims he was almost arrested for taking a picture under the Eiffel Tower on a donkey. But he claims he has a picture, but he hasn't produced it. All right. Mm-hmm. So there's like one example, right?
Right.
So if he ever produces that picture, then I'm put to shame. We'll have a whole other session about this. And I'm sorry, Dad, if you're watching. I believe him, actually. I believe the for the most part.
That's good.
I'm just saying, as a joke, facetiously, again, back to what I said, when human beings get involved, it gets messy. And it's not that I don't trust the eyewitnesses. It's not, I'm not trying to take any kind of atheist stance on anything. I think that's what Carrier does, more or less, if I understand his work correctly. But I don't know it in that depth. So I want to be careful about that and defer to you about that. But it's just that, I just think that human beings screw things up. So even if you think that this is the word of God and inspired by the Spirit, and human beings still screw stuff up.
Yeah.
And we just don't see it in the text. And so in the end, I think that these are literary works written by human beings with political, social, cultural, religious motivations, normal human motivations for writing them.
Thank you so much. Dylan Roberts, again, thank you for that super chat. I'm very interested in Paul's writings and how he differs from the Gospels. Does Paul think that Peter and the apostles in Jerusalem walked with Jesus, or that he had visions like him? I think it means that they had visions like him. He seems to think he is on par.
So forgive me if this seems a little too simplistic. This is how I tend to think about it. Peter and James are in Jerusalem. They walked with Jesus, to use that terminology. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. They were there. They were on the ground. They know what this original movement was about. Unfortunately, in my opinion, they didn't write anything down because they were not literate. But what we have is Paul's account of the situation. I don't count Acts because Acts, to my mind, is written much later, mythologizes things. But, Paul even has to kind of admit, these dudes are side-eyeing me. Who do you think you are to get involved in this? You weren't there, right? Especially, if Jesus is crucified and they witnessed that, that's a traumatic thing. He wasn't on the ground for what went down with Jesus, whatever happened to the historical Jesus. And there are Peter and James who are trying to continue this movement, this Jesus movement. And so Paul comes in saying that, you knew the guy, before he died, but the resurrected Jesus is appearing to me and telling me that I've been chosen by the God of Israel to be the messenger for the next stage of this thing. And so, I didn't know him in life, but I've talked to him more recently than you have. The risen Jesus is appearing to me. So I have the latest intel. And yes, he has to do that because he has to be on par right? Because he didn't know, he wasn't there in Jerusalem. He wasn't part of that original group.
Mhm.
His claim to authority is that he interprets Jewish scripture, that he was a Pharisee, that he is well educated, that he's well educated, meaning he also knows, again, Greek and Roman philosophy, and knows the Jewish scriptures, is very well spoken, and also, is having what's essentially divination experiences, which are very common in the ancient Mediterranean. People say that they're seeing gods all the time. So he just says that he's having these divination experiences. Sometimes Jesus tells him things that he did in his life, like the Eucharistic meal. Sometimes he doesn't, but that's where he's getting his information. And so that's where he derives his authority.
Thank you so much. Apollos Christian Apologetics. Thoughts on the idea that the Gospels were the literary redaction of prior traditions, sometimes eyewitness traditions, not necessarily eyewitness authors. Maybe Peter dictated a proto-Mark.
I mean, I guess anything's possible. I just don't know how you would prove it.
Is it my, and I just want to butt in so that we correctly understand your position. You have gone on record somewhat saying like, yeah, I think they learned some stories about Jesus, but they're floating around probably from somewhere and they made it into a literary novel, so to speak. Or...
Maybe. I mean, like what I resist is sometimes I get the feeling when I say like, hypothetically, the authors of the Gospels didn't have to be Christian. Like,
right.
Theoretically, they didn't have to be to write the story they wrote, because all of those philosophical ideas, teachings, the structure of a biography of like a subversive figure, that was all there for the taking. So in theory, the person didn't have to be even a Christian. I think sometimes when I've said that, sort of like to show the extreme option, people, right. He doesn't think the Gospels were Christian. And I'm like, now, wait a minute, like.
Right.
Well, calm down.
I get it.
Yeah. So basically, because I don't want to adhere to the idea of, say, like a Markan church, the oral tradition of the Markan church is what's represented by the Gospel of Mark. Because I don't want to go along with that, because I don't think that what we have historically are ancient authors speaking for whole groups or communities. What we have are ancient authors who are highly specialized. So few people are literate in the ancient world that there are only a select few people who have the capability of writing these kinds of texts. And those are the people I'm trying to learn more about. The thing is, as far as, maybe Peter dictating a proto-Mark, I guess it's possible. It's just that there's nothing in Mark that claims that. Mm-hmm. And, you would kind of think he would, right? Like you would think, or he would say this is the gospel according to Peter or something, right? The other problem with Mark, from my perspective as a scholar, is that I think it's informed by Paul. And so with all the static between Peter and Paul too, the idea of it being Peter's gospel becomes problematic. So this is why what I was saying before to Jonathan, like, you're never going to prove it. Like, I don't mean that to be a jerk, but, I hate to say never, never say never, but I would have to see more evidence than we have at the moment to demonstrate that.
Good point. David Aaron Hill.
I'll let the reader understand.
Gematria.
They're doing a
gematria type thing. I can't even read this. David, thank you for secretly jabbing us with, I don't know what it is. Some mystery. Do you understand it?
He's quoting at least one Bible with let the reader understand, and he's trying to use figures. Usually gematria is numbers. Uh-huh. I would have to go and look at the keystrokes.
Well, I wonder if the amount he's spending plays a part in 318. I don't know. Maybe it's some code or something. David, thank you for that super chat. Free Thinker Podcast, thank you for the super chat. How did the Jews in Matthew's guard story know exactly what Christ's third day prediction meant when the apostles had a hard time understanding what he meant? Mark 9:31-32. Thanks, Edward is it Tasmesian? Forgive me for butchering it.
I'm talking to him next week on a show too. So hi, thanks for saying hello. Awesome. I would say that that's exactly the kind of thing that seems to me like a literary device, right? Like a literary addition to a story that gives authenticity, gives credibility to claims being made in the document itself.
Thank you. We're almost there. Don't worry. Pocket Locker 86. Thank you, Jay. Boo, Derek, go away. We're having a nice time with John and Robin. Host ruin everything. Much love, brother. I'm sorry I'm such a bummer for you. For real. Anyway. Thank you. Grays 174, thoughts on undesigned coincidences. Have you ever heard of this?
No, what is this?
I'll butcher it trying to explain it, but there seems to be unintentional moments where the Gospels, while we'll say one Gospel may or may not know the other Gospels, there's kind of an apologetic by a certain group of Christians who are saying the Gospels are writing kind of almost unnoticeable details that kind of line up with the other ones. And it looks almost like these are just different eyewitness accounts that maybe they get some things differently, but they get some things very similar that you would imagine someone wouldn't have copied to try to make. I could be butchering this, by the way, but
no, but I'm just curious. So because I don't know exactly what it means, how is that different from like again, I'm not saying this in like jabbing you with a rhetorical question. Like I actually just don't know. Like why is that different from like redaction criticism or like comparison of, Mark's using Matthew and that kind of thing? Usually scholars lean on the idea that there's something in Matthew that looks like something in Mark. Well, that's an indication maybe that Matthew's reading Mark, right? So those coincidences can be explained through literary sharing.
I need to read just so you understand. It's Lydia McGrew. She is a Christian author and a scholar, I think, Christian apologist, who wrote a book called Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, revives an argument for the historical reliability of the New Testament that has been largely neglected for more than 100 years. And undesigned coincidence is an apparently casual yet puzzle-like fit between two or more texts, and its best explanations is that the authors knew the truth about the events they describe or allude to. Connections of this kind among passages in the Gospels, as well as between Acts and the Pauline epistles, give us reason to believe these documents came from honest eyewitness sources, people in the know about the events they relate, supported by careful research yet accessibly written, hidden in plain view, provide solid evidence that all Christians can use to defend the scriptures and the truth of Christianity.
Yeah, I'd have to look at it. It sounds to me like, if that's the conclusion you want to draw to begin your investigation of comparing these texts to one another, you would have to do that with it already in your mind. Like, I'm out to prove that these are eyewitnesses, and now I'm going to show you that. What I tend to do is I'm not going to take anything for granted. I'm going to read these texts and I'm going to treat them like any other kind of ancient literature and try to figure out who these authors were, what are they reading, what are they citing, how are they putting these texts together, because they chose to write. What are they writing?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, what were the historical conditions, circumstances, and constraints of authorship itself and putting together these texts as human beings? Let me start from there rather than go in, guns blazing, saying like, I'm here to prove these were eyewitnesses first. Now I'll show you, right? Like, that to me, again, I don't want to disparage another scholar or another author. And that might be the conclusion she draws somehow, but I would have to look at the book because I wouldn't go in assuming a conclusion before looking at the materials. And what I see when I look at the Gospels, especially the Synoptics, are three authors. I don't know in what order for sure, although I tend to lean towards Mark in priority, but I see three authors reading each other.
Thank you. Yeah. Kirk R says, you heard Robin right. The scriptures today are quick and easy. Very double entendre.
I'm never saying that, but it's possible.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Kirk. We did put the names in the hat. We're getting there. Bitter Truth, believe in religion is something you've given them lifetime business, fake stories, incorrect, science, hilarious.
I don't know what that means.
I don't either. Is something you're giving them lifetime business, fake stories, incorrect, science, hilarious.
I mean, I think it means going against all natural law, profiting off of it. You know what I mean? Like, religion does these things. Like
yeah,
that might
there's a lot of that. Well, thank you so much, Bitter Truth. I really appreciate it. I'm searching for one more. You said one more? We got one more. Dalai Lama in the house. Great discussion. Much love. Hell Eris. Am I pronouncing that last Eris? Hail Eris.
I don't know what's
Thank
going
you.
to happen to you now that you said that out loud.
Dalai Lama is a patron of mine, so I will forgive you. No, I'm just kidding. I have no clue particularly what Eris means exactly. Is that the name of a god? Could be. Anywho, we caught up. I really appreciate your time, and I think it's time that we do our raffling to see who wins, even though Jonathan, the cartoon artist, is not here, to help us out here, but he is going to do it. So whoever wins this, email me. Do not leave. Email me. We will get you your cartoon. I promise you. Let me do this wider so you can actually see my dad. Okay, let me put some music on. We need an altar call here.
My head, so I can't see.
Dad, we got to have an altar call here real quick.
Shipped the heck out of these guys.
Where is it at? Oh, here we go. Let's do you like the intro sound that I usually use, or do you want like this?
That's good and dramatic.
Put it like. Welcome to Dad, shake the hell out of
I
it.
have. I've been
Have
doing
you?
the
He's
whole
been
show.
shaking it the whole time.
Driving
So
me nuts.
I know, because he's like, I want this to be random.
Right.
So you're gonna reach in,
If I can even reach. Right?
grab one.
All right.
What number did we get?
We got. I marked it by number. Dalai
Are you
Lama.
kidding me?
No, I'm not.
Dude, Dalai Lama comes in at the end and won. What in the world?
I don't know. It was the very last question.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that crazy?
What are the odds?
What's
I mean,
more likely? That was fixed.
That's 124. No, that's-
yeah, that's actually, I bet you there's people who think this was fixed.
Do you see how hard it is?
Right? All right, let me turn this down here real quick. Seriously, Dalai Lama, you're going to have to message me. That is wild. The last super chatter actually won. And, well, you did get 5 names put in the thing for the 20. So
yeah, there's more. Yeah, exactly.
there was 5 possible chances that your name could have got pulled up for throwing that 20 in there. But yeah, we just witnessed a miracle. And we will have to set you up. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this debate. I really would say this is more like an educated discussion than it was so much a debate, and that's fine. I'm glad that we're not over here throwing names at each other and arguing rudely. If I may, to plug us on the way out here, Dr. Robin Faith Walsh has published a great book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature. Highly recommend. She goes into some fun, interesting stuff about the Satyricon, and she's also writing other stuff as we speak. Go check out her work. Check out her website. She's got her website. She says there's not much here, but
Well, the latest always says whatever's coming up next, or if I publish something new, I try to keep it up to date. On the top, there's a tab on the top. Those are just classes I teach.
got it. Okay,
Yep.
latest. Got it.
Yep.
Wow. Oh, wow. You're putting ours up there.
Yeah.
Cool. Go check out the website. And, okay. You can scroll down and actually see the whole thing pop up. Yeah, check out the website. It's in the description. All of this is in the description. Don't forget to go subscribe to Jonathan Sheffield's YouTube channel. He does create all the cartoons. Look at his channel. It's cartoons like crazy. And he's made my intros for us here at MythVision. Check out our Patreon. Help support us. We're kicking butt, taking names, doing all sorts of fun stuff. If you hit load more, you'll find in the catacombs of MythVision's Patreon all of the secret things that people don't want you to know. It's all down there. And you can join as little as $3 a month. You can go and sign up right now for the Ancient Greek Mystery Cults. We were talking about that earlier in the Q&A. Early bird special right now. And I wish I had the actual course open to show you how neat and cool it is. Go sign up. Go sign up. In the description. And the GoFundMe to go visit Paula Fredrickson, that's coming up. It's all in the description, I believe. I don't know if I have the GoFundMe in there. I need to get that in there. Dr. Walsh, any final words from you?
Thank you. And thank you, as always, to everybody who's watching. I know I get emails, and it can be disappointing that I don't write back right away. But trust me, my inbox is a nightmare. I do keep them in a file that I'll write when I'm not teaching full time. But I do enjoy hearing from people and enjoy coming on to talk to you, Derek. And Jonathan, you're not here, but it was such a delight. So thank you for the opportunity to to share my work and some of my thoughts be what they may. You know what I mean? But
yeah.
yeah.
You're still working on the Paul book, right?
Well, I'm
The
working.
Moon?
Oh yeah, that's where I'll give you an update. I've sent it in places. So we'll
Okay.
see what happens.
And then you're doing the Mark thing. So please, anytime you publish, hit me up. You know, I want to be like the first person, if possible, to like go out there and present it to our audience.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. Dalai Lama, lucky winner here. At the end, you snagged the cartoon with 120. That's all it took. And if you're interested in getting a custom 30-second cartoon made for you, you can email me, and there are 2 slots available to just purchase it. It's $250. Jonathan will create any custom cartoon that you want, 30 seconds. So all the funds go to MythVision for bringing on the academics like you to have these conversations with him. So he's just a friend helping out. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Never forget. And check out the cartoon, because Dr. Walsh is in it. She's one of the horsemen. We are MythVision.